Imagine a conversation where someone proposes that we should have stricter regulations on industrial pollution, and instead of engaging with that actual proposal, their opponent responds by saying that the first person wants to shut down all factories and destroy the entire economy and put millions of people out of work. This is a Strawman argument, and it happens constantly in our daily discourse, often so seamlessly that we barely notice its presence. The Strawman argument works by taking the original position, exaggerating it beyond recognition, adding elements that were never part of the initial claim, and then thoroughly dismantling this distorted version instead of addressing what was actually said. The person making the strawman feels they have won the debate because they have successfully defeated an argument, but what they have actually done is defeat a fictional version of an argument that their opponent never made. The mechanism behind this fallacy is remarkably simple yet psychologically powerful. Our brains naturally seek efficiency in processing information, and when we encounter a nuanced or complex position that we disagree with, our mind can unconsciously drift toward a more extreme version of that position because it is easier to refute. Additionally, strawman arguments trigger our emotional responses more effectively than addressing the real argument would, because the exaggerated version often contains elements designed to provoke frustration, anger, or concern. We see this happen in political debates, family arguments, workplace disagreements, and online discussions with startling frequency. Yet despite the fact that this fallacy is logically invalid and adds nothing to genuine understanding, it has become normalized as an acceptable rhetorical tactic. Consider a moment when you're scrolling through social media and you encounter someone making an argument about climate policy, economic reform, or healthcare systems. Yet instead of engaging with the substance of what they're saying, you find yourself noticing that they have poor grammar, or they're wearing an unflattering shirt in their profile picture, or you remember they once said something problematic years ago. And suddenly all of this becomes reason enough to dismiss their entire argument without actually addressing a single point they've made. This is the ad hominem fallacy in its most common form, where we attack the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. The mechanism is surprisingly elegant in its efficiency. Our brains are constantly seeking shortcuts through the overwhelming amount of information we encounter daily, and attacking a person's character, appearance, credentials, or past behavior feels like a legitimate form of evaluation because it seems to tell us something meaningful about the reliability of their message. We tell ourselves that if someone is flawed in this particular way, then surely their ideas must be flawed as well, even though these things are entirely separable. Psychologically, this fallacy serves a comforting function because it allows us to feel intellectually satisfied without doing the harder work of actually analyzing ideas on their merits. It also provides a social bonding mechanism, allowing groups to unite against an outsider by attacking their character rather than engaging with their perspective. What's particularly curious about how normalized ad hominem has become is that we've essentially accepted a form of reasoning that would be laughable in any formal setting, yet we employ it constantly in our daily discourse. Imagine a conversation with someone close to you where you express a concern about something they said or did, and instead of addressing your concern directly, they tell you that you misremembered the event entirely, that you are being too sensitive, or that the situation never happened the way you described it at all. You begin to doubt your own memory and perception of reality, second-guessing what you clearly remember experiencing, and this disorientation becomes the primary outcome of the interaction rather than any genuine resolution or understanding between the two people involved. Gaslighting operates as a psychological manipulation tactic where one person systematically convinces another that their perception of events, their memories, or their emotional responses are fundamentally unreliable or incorrect, creating a state of persistent uncertainty and self-doubt in the target. The gaslighter accomplishes this through deliberate denial of facts, selective withholding of information, trivializing of concerns, diverting conversations away from the actual issue, or outright lying about events and circumstances. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the exploitation of our natural human tendency to rely on external validation and consensus to confirm our understanding of reality. Because when someone we trust consistently contradicts our recollection of events or our emotional interpretations, we begin to question the reliability of our own mind as an instrument for understanding the world. What makes gaslighting particularly insidious is that it operates beneath the surface of logical argumentation, avoiding direct contradiction in favor of creating pervasive doubt and confusion that undermines a person's confidence in their own judgment and intuition. Consider the moment when you walk into a coffee shop and the barista asks you a simple question: would you like your coffee hot or iced? The question seems straightforward enough, yet it presents you with a false choice that obscures the reality of what is actually possible. You could request your coffee at a lukewarm temperature, you could ask for it with a single ice cube, you could request it heated to a specific degree, or you could choose not to order coffee at all. The false dilemma works by presenting only two options when in reality there exist numerous possibilities along a spectrum. This logical fallacy, also known as a false binary or black and white thinking, operates by artificially constraining the range of choices available to us and forcing us to select from an incomplete set of alternatives. When someone tells you that you must either support their political candidate completely or you are against them, they are committing the same error by eliminating the possibility of nuanced positions, partial agreement, or complete indifference. The mechanism behind this fallacy is deceptively simple. By narrowing the frame of reference, the person making the argument hopes to guide your thinking toward their preferred conclusion without requiring you to consciously acknowledge that other options existed all along. This works particularly well in moments of stress or fatigue because our brains, already taxed from decision-making throughout the day, will often accept the simplified binary rather than expend the mental energy required to imagine alternatives. We have normalized this fallacy to such an extraordinary degree that it permeates nearly every aspect of our daily experience, from marketing campaigns that ask us to choose between two brands while ignoring generic alternatives, to political discourse that demands absolute loyalty or complete rejection, to personal relationships where we are told we must either accept something fully or else. Imagine a parent telling their teenager that they cannot attend a party because if they go to one party, they will inevitably start going to every party, which will lead to skipping school, which will naturally result in dropping out entirely. And therefore the only logical conclusion is that attending this single social gathering will ultimately destroy their future and ruin their life. This is the slippery slope fallacy in its most recognizable form, yet we encounter versions of this reasoning constantly throughout our daily conversations and decision-making processes without ever acknowledging its fundamental illogic. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. The argument takes a first step or initial action and assumes, without any actual evidence or logical necessity, that this step will inexorably lead to a series of increasingly extreme consequences, each one flowing automatically into the next with no possibility of stopping or changing course at any point along the way. It creates a chain of causation that feels intuitive because we can imagine the steps, but it ignores the reality that humans have agency, can make different choices at each stage, and that intervening factors almost always exist that could halt the supposed inevitable progression. The psychological appeal of this fallacy runs deep because our brains are pattern recognition machines that naturally seek connections and trends, making us vulnerable to seeing inevitable sequences where only possibilities actually exist. We worry that if we allow one exception to a rule, we will suddenly find ourselves unable to enforce any rules at all, or that if we make one small compromise on our principles, we will inevitably compromise them entirely until we have no principles remaining. Imagine you are having a conversation with someone about a specific claim they made, and you present evidence that directly contradicts what they said, yet instead of acknowledging the contradiction, they shift their argument to something slightly different, reframing the discussion in such a way that your evidence no longer applies. And then when you address this new claim with equally compelling counter-evidence, they shift again to yet another variation of their original position, creating an endless cycle where the standards for what constitutes proof or agreement seem to perpetually change like a goalpost being moved further down an endless field. Moving the goalposts is a logical fallacy wherein a person changes the criteria for success or truth after an initial claim has been challenged or refuted, making it impossible to ever prove them wrong because the conditions of the debate themselves become a moving target that cannot be pinned down or definitively addressed. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite fascinating, as it often stems from a deep-seated resistance to admitting error or being proven incorrect. And rather than confronting this discomfort directly, the human mind has developed this sophisticated defense mechanism wherein the parameters of the argument itself become malleable and responsive to whatever evidence or counterargument is presented. functioning as a way to preserve one's sense of being right, without ever having to actually be right in any measurable or verifiable sense. What makes this fallacy so insidious is that it operates beneath the surface of conscious awareness for many people, and it has become so normalized in our social and political discourse that we often do not recognize it happening in real time, whether it is occurring in personal relationships where someone keeps changing what they claim their partner promised to do, or in public debates where definitions and standards shift constantly. Imagine a discussion where someone presents a serious concern about a problem in society, perhaps pointing out that a particular institution has failed to protect vulnerable people, and instead of addressing the substance of that claim, another person responds by saying, "Well, what about when the other side did something similar?" Or, "What about the problems in that other country?" Or, "What about what happened 10 years ago?" This deflection technique, known as whataboutism, effectively redirects the conversation away from the original issue by introducing an unrelated or tangentially related problem as though it invalidates the initial concern. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite sophisticated, as it exploits our innate sense of fairness and balance, making us feel that pointing out one problem is somehow unfair or biased unless we simultaneously acknowledge all comparable problems everywhere. When someone employs whataboutism, they are not actually engaging with the argument presented. Rather, they are attempting to create what feels like moral equivalence or to suggest that the person raising the concern lacks credibility due to selective attention. The technique persists so effectively in our daily discourse because it leverages our desire to appear balanced and our discomfort with being perceived as hypocritical, causing us to abandon our original point in pursuit of a more comprehensive accounting of all possible wrongs. We have normalized whataboutism so thoroughly that entire conversations can be derailed by a single whatabout, and people often feel obligated to defend themselves against the implicit accusation of bias rather than continuing to discuss the original substantive issue. Even though the existence of one problem does not logically require that all other problems be addressed simultaneously, or that the original problem becomes less valid simply because other problems also exist somewhere in the world. Consider the moment when a celebrity endorses a particular brand of dietary supplement on television, and millions of viewers immediately purchase that product despite having no medical training themselves, or when a famous actor discusses climate policy with the same conviction they bring to their film roles, and their opinions are treated as factual evidence rather than personal speculation. This is the appeal to authority fallacy in its most recognizable form, a cognitive pattern so deeply woven into our daily lives that we often fail to notice when we have accepted a conclusion not because of the strength of its reasoning, but simply because someone impressive or famous has said it. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is surprisingly elegant and rooted in our evolutionary past. Our ancestors lived in small communities where respecting the opinions of experienced hunters, healers, or elders genuinely improved their chances of survival, creating a mental shortcut that served us well for thousands of years. This heuristic, this mental efficiency tool, tells us that if someone has achieved prominence or credibility in one domain, their judgment likely extends to other domains as well, even when there is absolutely no logical reason why this should be true. A brilliant physicist possesses no inherent advantage in understanding nutrition, yet we listen to their dietary recommendations with rapt attention. A successful businessperson's views on education policy carry no more weight than anyone else's careful research, yet we defer to their experience. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent in modern society is that we have built entire industries and information ecosystems around the amplification of authoritative voices. We continue to accept appeals to authority not because the reasoning has improved or because we have somehow become more logical, but rather because we have normalized the conflation of expertise. Consider the moment when a new social media platform suddenly becomes ubiquitous, and millions of people join not because they have carefully evaluated its unique features or determined it genuinely serves their needs better than alternatives, but rather because everyone else is doing it, because their friends are there, because they fear missing out on a cultural moment they cannot afford to ignore socially. This is the bandwagon effect in its purest form, a cognitive bias so pervasive that we rarely notice when we are swept up in its current, moving along with the crowd simply because the crowd itself has become the primary argument for participation. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in our evolutionary past, in the deeply embedded human tendency to seek safety in numbers, to assume that if many people believe something or do something, then that thing must carry validity or correctness that we ourselves might not have the expertise to verify independently. Our brains essentially outsource the difficult work of individual evaluation to the collective decision-making of others around us, treating popularity as a shorthand for truth or wisdom or desirability. We watch as certain political candidates gain momentum not necessarily because their policy positions are superior, but because media coverage of their rising polls makes them seem inevitable, makes joining their movement feel like aligning ourselves with the future rather than making a reasoned choice. We adopt fashion trends, dietary preferences, entertainment choices, and even moral stances not because we have contemplated them thoroughly, but because participation in these trends grants us social belonging and saves us the cognitive effort of developing independent judgments. What makes this fallacy so insidious is that it operates almost invisibly, masquerading as legitimate consensus or cultural evolution when it is merely the mathematical effect of millions of people. Imagine you're having a conversation with a colleague about why the company's budget was spent inefficiently, and instead of addressing your concerns directly, they pivot the discussion entirely by bringing up how well the marketing department performed last quarter, or they suddenly start talking passionately about a completely unrelated achievement or problem that has nothing to do with the original issue you raised. This is the red herring fallacy in its most common form, and it happens to us constantly in daily life without most of us even noticing. The red herring is a distraction technique where someone introduces irrelevant information into an argument, deliberately or unconsciously shifting attention away from the central point of contention toward something else entirely that seems important or emotionally resonant, but is fundamentally beside the point. The term itself comes from an old practice of dragging a smoked fish across a hunting trail to confuse and distract the hunting dogs from following the scent they were supposed to be tracking. And that historical metaphor captures perfectly what happens in our minds when we encounter this fallacy. When a red herring is introduced into a discussion, our attention naturally gravitates toward this new, often emotionally charged piece of information because our brains are wired to respond to novel stimuli and things that trigger our emotions, whether those emotions are pride, anger, concern, or curiosity. The mechanism works because the new information is usually not entirely irrelevant to the broader context of a conversation, which gives it just enough plausibility to seem like it might matter, and this slight connection to the original topic creates just enough cognitive friction that we often don't consciously recognize we've been led astray from the actual argument. Imagine you have spent $300 on a gym membership that you signed up for at the beginning of the year, and now it is November, and you have not been to the gym in 8 months. Your initial instinct is to keep paying for the membership and perhaps start going again soon, because you have already invested so much money into it, and it would be wasteful to let that investment disappear without getting your money's worth. This is the sunk cost fallacy in its most recognizable form, where past expenditures that cannot be recovered influence your present and future decisions in ways that are entirely irrational and contrary to your actual well-being. The fallacy operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how costs and benefits should be weighed when making choices, because the money you have already spent is gone regardless of what you do today or tomorrow. What actually matters for your decision are the costs and benefits moving forward, yet our minds persistently anchor themselves to those previous investments as though they still possess present value. When you think about your gym membership, the $300 is truly a sunk cost, and whether you attend the gym or cancel your membership, that money does not come back to you, which means it should play absolutely no role in determining whether you continue paying. The only relevant consideration should be whether the future benefits of attending the gym from this moment onward justify the future costs of maintaining the membership, yet we find ourselves trapped by the weight of past choices. This cognitive bias extends far beyond gym memberships into nearly every domain of human decision-making, from relationships where people stay in situations they are unhappy with because they have already invested years, to business ventures where companies continue funding failing projects because they have already poured millions into development, to educational pursuits where sent. Imagine you have formed an opinion about something, perhaps a political candidate or a particular brand of product or even a belief about how a certain group of people behaves, and from that moment forward, your mind begins a subtle but powerful process of filtering reality itself. When you encounter information that supports what you already believe, you accept it readily, you share it with others, you remember it vividly, and it feels like confirmation that you were right all along. But when you stumble upon information that contradicts your existing belief, something different happens entirely. You scrutinize it more harshly, you question its source, you find reasons to doubt its validity, or you simply forget about it entirely within hours. This is confirmation bias, and it operates in your mind with such constancy and invisibility that you may never once recognize it is happening. The mechanism underlying this fallacy is rooted in cognitive efficiency and emotional comfort. Your brain processes an incomprehensible amount of information every single moment, and it has developed shortcuts to manage this overwhelming input. Holding a consistent belief about the world requires less mental energy than constantly updating your worldview, and beliefs provide a sense of psychological stability and identity. When new information arrives that challenges what you believe, it creates a state of cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between conflicting ideas, and your mind naturally works to resolve this discomfort by rejecting, reinterpreting, or simply ignoring the challenging information. What is perhaps most remarkable about confirmation bias is how thoroughly it has become embedded in the architecture of modern communication itself. Social media algorithms learn your preferences and show you more content aligned with your existing views. News organizations cater to particular ideological audiences, and we increasingly choose to follow P. Imagine walking into a workplace where someone with minimal experience confidently leads meetings, interrupts experts with unwarranted corrections, and genuinely believes they understand complex systems after reading a single article or watching a few online videos, while the actual specialists in the room remain quietly uncertain, second-guessing their own knowledge and asking cautious questions about matters they have spent years studying. This peculiar inversion of confidence and competence represents one of the most pervasive psychological patterns affecting how we perceive our own abilities and the abilities of others around us. The mechanism underlying this effect emerges from a fundamental cognitive blind spot where individuals who possess only superficial knowledge or minimal skill in a particular domain lack the very metacognitive tools necessary to recognize the depth of their own ignorance. When someone has just begun learning about a subject, their brain constructs a simplified mental model that feels complete and coherent, creating an illusion of understanding that generates genuine confidence because they do not yet know enough to recognize what they do not know. Conversely, as genuine experts continue developing their mastery, they encounter increasing complexity and discover nuances and exceptions and edge cases that reveal how vast the actual landscape of knowledge truly is, which paradoxically makes them more aware of their limitations and more cautious in their assertions. We have somehow normalized this pattern so thoroughly that it now shapes everything from workplace dynamics to social media discourse to political engagement, where those with the least understanding often speak with the most volume and certainty, while those with actual expertise find themselves paralyzed by awareness of what remains unknown. Imagine a conversation where someone makes a broad claim about a group they belong to, and when confronted with evidence that contradicts their claim, they simply redefine the group to exclude the inconvenient example. A person might say that Scottish people are honest and hardworking, but when presented with a Scottish criminal or someone known for laziness, they respond by saying that no true Scotsman would behave that way, thereby protecting their original statement from any possible refutation through the simple act of redefinition. This is the no true Scotsman fallacy in its purest form, a rhetorical maneuver that makes claims unfalsifiable by moving the goalposts whenever evidence threatens to undermine the assertion. The mechanism works because it allows people to maintain their cherished beliefs about groups, ideologies, or categories without ever having to acknowledge that their original statement might have been too broad or inaccurate. When someone claims all members of a political party care about the poor, and you point to a party member who clearly does not, they can simply declare that person is not a true believer in the party's values, thus preserving the original claim through semantic redefinition rather than logical reasoning. The fallacy persists because it feels intuitively satisfying. It allows us to hold onto our generalizations about groups we identify with while maintaining a sense of moral or intellectual consistency. We encounter this everywhere in human discourse, from religious communities excluding members who do not follow teachings strictly enough, to sports fans dismissing other fans as not true supporters when they disagree about team loyalty, to political movements distancing themselves from members whose actions become embarrassing or controversial. Imagine a marksman firing dozens of bullets at the side of a barn without any particular target in mind, and then afterward, he walks over to the barn and draws a bullseye circle around the tightest cluster of bullet holes he can find, declaring himself an expert sharpshooter who never misses. This is the essence of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a pattern recognition error where someone retroactively identifies patterns in random data and then treats those patterns as if they were meaningful predictions or evidence of skill. The fallacy occurs when we observe a large dataset of information, notice a coincidental cluster or correlation, and immediately construct an explanation around it, claiming we have discovered something significant when in fact we have simply found what we were looking for within the noise of randomness. A person might notice that 3 of their friends who wear red shirts have succeeded in their careers and conclude that wearing red promotes success, conveniently ignoring the hundreds of red shirt wearers who have failed and the thousands of successful people who wore other colors. The psychological mechanism behind this tendency involves our brain's deeply ingrained need to find patterns and create narratives, a feature that evolved to help us survive by quickly identifying threats and opportunities in our environment. However, in a modern world filled with vast amounts of data and information, this pattern-seeking mechanism often misfires, causing us to see meaningful connections where none exist and to construct false causal relationships between unrelated events. We normalize this fallacy constantly in how we interpret historical events, financial markets, and personal anecdotes, often selecting only the data points that confirm our existing beliefs while discarding or forgetting the contradictory evidence, thereby reinforcing our conviction that we have identified a genuine truth when we have actually engaged in it. Imagine walking through a cemetery and observing that nearly every gravestone belongs to someone who died in their 70s or 80s, and you begin to wonder why so few people die young. This thought pattern emerges because you are only seeing the people who survived long enough to receive gravestones, while the countless infants, children, and young adults who died are buried elsewhere or cremated without monuments, existing only in statistical records and family memories that fade over time. Survivorship bias occurs when we examine only the things that have made it through some kind of selection process and then draw conclusions about all things, ignoring the silent evidence of those that did not survive the process. During World War II, military statisticians noticed that returning aircraft had the most damage on their wings and fuselages, but comparatively little damage near the engines, leading them to initially recommend reinforcing the wings and fuselages. A brilliant analyst recognized that they were only examining planes that had returned safely, and the planes that had been shot down and never came back likely suffered damage in the very places where the surviving aircraft showed the least impact, meaning the engines were probably the critical vulnerability that sent aircraft spiraling from the sky. The bias persists in our daily consumption of success stories because we hear extensively about the entrepreneur who dropped out of college and built a billion-dollar company, while we hear nothing about the thousands who dropped out and ended up in debt or failure, creating a distorted perception that abandoning traditional education is a pathway to extraordinary wealth. We read autobiographies of remarkable athletes and executives who attribute their success to waking up at 5 in the morning, positive thinking, or following a specific diet. Yet we have no access to the countless people who woke up at 5 every single day and pose. Imagine you are reading a news article about a scientific study on coffee consumption, and the headline declares that coffee is dangerous for your health, citing one particular finding that coffee drinkers showed elevated stress levels in a small sample of 50 people. Yet the actual study involved 5,000 participants and found overwhelming evidence that moderate coffee consumption provides significant cardiovascular benefits for the vast majority of people. And somehow that contradicting evidence never made it into the article you read. This is cherry picking, one of the most pervasive logical fallacies operating in our daily lives, where someone selects only the specific pieces of information that support their predetermined conclusion while deliberately or unconsciously ignoring all the evidence that contradicts or complicates that narrative. The mechanism operates at a deeply psychological level because our brains are naturally drawn to information that confirms what we already believe, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. And when we encounter a sea of complex data, statistics, or arguments, Our minds instinctively filter out the inconvenient parts and spotlight the convenient ones, making selective evidence feel like a complete picture, even though we have fundamentally distorted reality through strategic omission. What makes cherry-picking so insidious is that the selected evidence is often completely factual and legitimate on its own, but by extracting it from context and presenting it as representative of the whole, it becomes fundamentally misleading. And we have normalized this practice across our media ecosystem, our political discourse, our social media feeds, and even our casual conversations with friends and family, where we casually mention the one study that supports our diet while forgetting the dozen that contradict it. Imagine you wake up one morning and decide to wear your lucky red shirt, the one you haven't worn in months, and later that day you receive unexpected good news about a job promotion you've been hoping for. So naturally your mind concludes that wearing the red shirt caused the promotion to happen, and from that moment forward, you wear the red shirt before every important meeting or event because you genuinely believe it influences outcomes in your favor. This is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, a Latin phrase meaning, after this, therefore because of this, which describes our deeply ingrained human tendency to assume that if event B happened after event A, then event A must have caused event B to occur, even when no causal relationship actually exists between them. The mechanism behind this fallacy is rooted in how our brains have evolved to detect patterns and establish cause and effect relationships as a survival mechanism. Because in ancestral environments, recognizing that touching fire causes pain or that certain plants cause illness was genuinely useful for staying alive. But this pattern recognition ability becomes a liability in modern life, where coincidence and correlation are far more common than causation. Yet our brains continue firing in the same ancient way. We see this fallacy everywhere in daily life. A person starts taking vitamin supplements and feels healthier the following week, so they attribute their improved health to the vitamins when actually they've simply been sleeping better and exercising more regularly. Or someone changes their morning routine to include meditation, and meditation gets credited with a promotion that was actually earned through consistent hard work over years. Or a company launches a new marketing campaign and sales increase the following quarter. So they invest heavily in that campaign when the increase was actually driven by seasonal demand or a competitor going out of business. Imagine you ask someone why they believe a particular religious doctrine is true, and they respond by citing passages from that very same religious text as evidence, never stepping outside the system to provide independent verification or external support for their claims. This is circular reasoning, one of the most pervasive logical fallacies that pervades our daily conversations and decision-making processes without most of us even noticing its presence. The mechanism works by using a conclusion as part of the evidence meant to support that same conclusion, creating a closed loop of reasoning that never actually breaks free from its own assumptions. When someone argues that a law should exist because it is the law, or that a product is the best because the company says it is the best, or that we should trust an authority figure because that authority figure says they are trustworthy, they are engaging in this circular trap. The psychological appeal of circular reasoning lies in its ability to feel complete and self-contained to the person constructing it. Our brains find comfort in systems that seem internally consistent, and circular reasoning provides exactly that illusion of consistency without requiring any external validation or evidence that might complicate matters. We encounter this fallacy everywhere in modern life. In corporate marketing that claims a brand is superior because millions of people choose it, in political discourse where politicians defend their policies by pointing to their own stated principles, in social groups where beliefs persist simply because group members continue to believe them. The reason circular reasoning persists so stubbornly in human thought despite its logical invalidity is that it requires less cognitive effort than finding genuinely independent evidence, and it provides psychological reassurance through self-reinforcement. Imagine a conversation where someone asserts that a particular political candidate is unfit for office because they lack the qualities necessary to be fit for office. Or someone claims that a book is worth reading because it contains content that makes it valuable to read. Or a parent tells a child that they cannot stay up late because it is a rule that children must go to bed early. And when asked why that rule exists, the parent responds that it is simply how things should be done. In each of these scenarios, the speaker has structured their argument in such a way that the conclusion they are trying to prove is already contained within their premise, disguised in slightly different language or phrasing. This is the essence of begging the question, a logical fallacy so subtle and pervasive that it often goes unnoticed in casual conversation, professional discourse, and even academic settings. The mechanism at work here involves circular reasoning, where the argument loops back on itself without ever providing genuine evidence or justification for the claim being made. When someone begs the question, they assume the truth of what they are attempting to demonstrate, effectively using their conclusion as support for itself, which means they have provided no new information that would actually convince a skeptical listener. What makes this fallacy particularly insidious is that it can be wrapped in authoritative language, confident tone, and formal sentence structure that makes it sound reasonable and substantive when examined only superficially. We encounter begging the question constantly in marketing, where products are described as essential because they solve problems that only those products can solve, in politics where policies are defended as necessary because they represent necessary policies, and in personal relationships where beliefs are justified simply by restating those beliefs with added conviction. Imagine a conversation where someone points out that your behavior is problematic or hypocritical, and instead of addressing their criticism on its merits, you immediately respond by saying that they do the exact same thing, or something equally bad, or perhaps something even worse. This is the two-quote fallacy, a Latin phrase meaning you also, and it represents one of the most reflexive and intuitive ways humans deflect from accountability in everyday discourse. When a parent tells their teenager not to stay up late scrolling on their phone because it damages sleep quality, the teenager responds with an accusation that the parent does the same thing every night and therefore has no right to make such demands. When a politician is caught in a scandal involving financial impropriety, their defense team immediately points out that politicians from the opposing party have committed similar or worse offenses, suggesting that the original criticism is therefore invalid or hypocritical. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about shifting the burden of proof and reframing the conversation away from the original claim. Instead of engaging with whether the initial criticism is logically sound or factually accurate, the two-quote response attempts to undermine the credibility of the person making the accusation by highlighting their own inconsistencies. The psychological appeal is powerful because it taps into our deeply rooted sense of fairness and our natural suspicion of hypocrisy. We are evolutionarily primed to notice when others fail to live by their own stated standards, and this fallacy exploits that tendency brilliantly. What makes two-quote so persistent in modern life is that it often contains a kernel of truth, and pointing out genuine hypocrisy is sometimes legitimate and relevant, yet we have allowed this valid observation to become a universal shield against all criticism, regardless of whether the hypocrisy is actually material. Consider the moment when a politician stands before a crowd and speaks not about policy details or economic data, but instead tells the story of a single family who lost their home, describing in vivid detail the mother's tears, the children's confusion, the father's desperation. And in doing so, the audience feels such overwhelming compassion that they find themselves ready to support whatever solution the politician proposes. Regardless of whether that solution has actually been proven effective, or whether the emotional narrative represents a statistically common occurrence or merely an outlier designed specifically to move hearts rather than inform minds. The appeal to emotion works by deliberately bypassing the rational evaluation centers of our brain and instead activating our empathetic responses, our desire to alleviate suffering, and our instinctive need to help those who are struggling, which are fundamentally good human instincts that have evolved over millennia to help us survive as social creatures. Yet these instincts become problematic when they are weaponized as a substitute for actual evidence or logical reasoning. What makes this fallacy so pervasive in our daily lives is that emotion itself is not inherently opposed to truth. Indeed, many true statements can and should evoke emotional responses, and many false statements fail to move us at all, yet the appeal to emotion specifically uses the intensity of feeling as the primary justification for belief, rather than as an accompaniment to sound reasoning, creating a situation where the strength of our emotional reaction becomes confused with the validity of the underlying argument. We have somehow normalized this in our culture to such a degree that we barely notice it anymore, finding ourselves swayed by heartwarming stories in advertisements, by fear-based messaging in news reports, by anger-inducing social media posts, and by guilt-laden charitable appeals, all of which may see. Imagine scrolling through your social media feed on an ordinary evening when you encounter a post claiming that a new disease is spreading rapidly through your city, accompanied by alarming language about how you and your loved ones are vulnerable and at serious risk. Yet the post offers no credible evidence or statistical data to support these claims, only the emotional weight of dread designed to compel you toward a particular action or belief without logical foundation. This is the appeal to fear, one of the most pervasive and effective manipulation tactics in modern communication, where instead of presenting rational arguments supported by evidence and reason, a speaker or advertiser deliberately invokes anxiety, worry, or terror in their audience to bypass critical thinking and move them toward acceptance of a conclusion. The psychological mechanism operates on a fundamental level of human survival instinct. Our brains are evolutionarily wired to prioritize threats and dangers, meaning that when fear is triggered, the prefrontal cortex responsible for logical analysis becomes less active while the amygdala, our emotional processing center, takes command of our decision-making process. Politicians employ this constantly when they describe catastrophic futures that will only be prevented if you vote for them. Insurance companies warn you endlessly about unlikely scenarios that could devastate your finances if you don't purchase their product. And news outlets sensationalize stories with alarming graphics and ominous music to keep you watching despite minimal actual threat to your personal safety. What makes this fallacy so normalized and persistent in our daily lives is that fear itself is not illogical. Genuine threats do exist, and caution is sometimes warranted, which creates the perfect camouflage for manipulative fear-mongering, allowing bad actors to hide their logical fallacy behind the veneer of legitimate safety concerns. Imagine you're at a social gathering and you overhear someone mention that a colleague of yours was caught in a minor scandal at work. Nothing serious, just a misunderstanding about how a project was handled. Yet immediately your mind begins to wonder whether people will now view you differently simply because you work in the same department, and this concern feels entirely reasonable to you in that moment. Even though logically you had nothing to do with their actions and your own work record remains unchanged and unblemished. This is guilt by association, a cognitive mechanism where we attribute the negative qualities or actions of one person to another person merely because they share some connection, whether professional, social, or circumstantial. The logical fallacy operates on a fundamental confusion between correlation and causation, or more accurately, between proximity and culpability, suggesting that if someone is near us or connected to us in some way, then their moral failures or mistakes somehow transfer to us like a contagion. The mechanism behind this fallacy runs deep in human psychology because our brains are pattern-seeking machines that evolved to identify threats and group memberships quickly. And when we see someone associated with negative behavior, our ancestral survival instincts trigger us to distance ourselves from that person to avoid being caught in the same social danger or reputational harm. We use association as a shortcut to determine safety and status, which means guilt by association can happen almost automatically without conscious deliberation or rational thought. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent in modern life is that we have actually institutionalized it in many ways, from criminal gang profiling to workplace policies that scrutinize employees by their connections, to social media pylons where anyone who follows or likes certain content faces suspicion, normalizing the idea that you see. False equivalence occurs when two fundamentally different things, situations, or arguments are treated as though they are morally, logically, or practically equivalent when they are not, and this happens to us constantly in ways we rarely notice or question. Consider the person who argues that because both a medical doctor and a self-taught internet researcher have opinions about vaccines, their views carry equal weight and deserve equal consideration, despite the doctor having spent years in rigorous training while the other person simply spent hours scrolling through social media posts. The mechanism at work here involves a collapsing of context and credential, a flattening of nuance that makes complex distinctions disappear beneath the surface of seemingly neutral language. When someone says that rejecting a job offer is the same as being fired from that job, or that a minor inconvenience is equivalent to genuine suffering, they are performing this same sleight of hand, removing the qualitative differences that actually matter and pretending that mere structural similarity means substantive similarity. The psychological appeal of false equivalence runs deep because it allows us to feel intellectually consistent and morally fair while actually avoiding the difficult work of distinguishing between things that require different evaluations. It creates the illusion of balance and open-mindedness when we treat unequal things as equal, and we have grown so accustomed to this rhetorical move in our culture that we often accept it without the skepticism it deserves. What makes this particularly insidious is that equivalence itself is not always wrong, and there are genuine cases where different things should be treated similarly, which means false equivalence can hide within the appearance of reasonable thinking. Imagine you have a single negative experience at a restaurant on a Tuesday evening where the service was slow and the food arrived cold, and from that one encounter, you decide that this establishment is simply incompetent and will never return, while simultaneously telling everyone you know that they should avoid it entirely. This is hasty generalization in its most recognizable form, a cognitive shortcut where we take limited information from a small sample size and apply it broadly to an entire category, group, or entity without sufficient evidence to warrant such a sweeping conclusion. The fallacy operates on the principle that our brains are designed for efficiency rather than accuracy, and when we encounter a few examples of something, our minds naturally extrapolate those instances into universal truths, creating patterns from minimal data points as a way to navigate an overwhelmingly complex world. We see one person from a particular profession behave dishonestly, and we conclude that all people in that profession are untrustworthy. We read about one negative news story involving a specific demographic, and we assign those characteristics to millions of individuals we have never met. We try a new cuisine once, and it does not suit our palate, so we declare that we simply do not like that food category forever. The persistence of hasty generalization is almost invisible in our daily discourse because it feels entirely natural and serves an immediate psychological purpose of creating order and predictability in an uncertain environment. Our ancestors relied on rapid generalization for survival, making split-second decisions based on limited observations when accuracy took a backseat to speed. And while that mechanism once protected us from genuine threats, it now leads us to make judgments about politics, cultures, professions, and people based on fragments of experience rather than comprehensive evidence. Imagine you are at a casino, standing before a roulette wheel that has landed on black 8 consecutive times, and you feel an almost magnetic pull toward betting on red, convinced that red is now somehow due to appear, as though the wheel itself has memory and obligation to balance past outcomes. This is the gambler's fallacy, and it emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding of probability and randomness that persists even among mathematically literate individuals. The fallacy operates on the belief that past results in independent random events influence the probability of future results, creating an illusion that nature or chance has a memory that demands correction. When you flip a fair coin 10 times and get heads each time, your intuition screams that tails must come next, that the universe owes you balance, yet each flip remains completely independent with precisely the same 50% probability regardless of what came before. The psychological mechanism behind this error traces back to our deep-seated need to find patterns and detect order in chaos, a tendency that served our ancestors well when they were identifying genuine patterns in nature, but now betrays us in truly random contexts. We are pattern-seeking creatures by design, and our brains rebel against the notion of true randomness because it feels intuitively unstable and frightening. So we construct narratives where sequences must eventually balance, where luck must turn, where the universe maintains an internal accounting system. This fallacy persists because we rarely encounter pure randomness in our evolutionary history, and when we do gamble or play games of chance, the occasional confirmation of our false belief only strengthens it, as we remember the times our prediction came true and conveniently forget the many times it did not. Imagine a conversation about whether social media is harmful to children, and someone makes a bold claim that all digital technology is destroying young minds entirely. When you push back with evidence that some educational apps actually improve learning outcomes, they suddenly retreat to a much smaller, safer position, saying they merely meant that excessive screen time can be problematic, which is something you'd likely agree with anyway. This strategic retreat from an indefensible castle to a fortified position is the essence of the Motte and Bailey fallacy, a tactic that derives its name from medieval castle architecture, where a motte is a small, easily defended mound, and a bailey is a larger, less defensible outer wall. The fallacy works by having someone make a dramatic, attention-grabbing claim that is difficult to defend logically, and when challenged, they quickly withdraw to a much more modest and reasonable position that was never truly in dispute. The psychological mechanism here involves establishing authority and engagement through bold statements, then using the appearance of reasonable compromise when confronted, which actually allows the original extreme position to linger in people's minds even as the speaker appears to concede. We encounter this constantly in political discourse, marketing, and everyday arguments, where someone might claim that a competitor's product will literally ruin your life, but when questioned, they merely meant it is slightly less effective than theirs, creating a false sense of victory for the listener while the extreme claim has already shaped perception. What makes this fallacy particularly insidious is that the retreat to the defensible position often feels like an honest acknowledgement of nuance, making the person appear thoughtful and reasonable, when in reality they have simply played a rhetorical game that allowed them to anchor the conversation around their original extreme framing before SDR. Imagine you are in a debate with someone, or perhaps you are reading an article online, and your opponent presents you with dozens of claims, statistics, and arguments all at once, delivered with such rapid-fire precision that you find yourself overwhelmed and unable to respond to any single point effectively. This is the Gish Gallop, named after creationist Dwayne Gish, who perfected this rhetorical technique during debates about evolution. The person deploying this strategy floods the conversation with so many arguments, facts, half-truths, and outright fabrications that your opponent simply cannot address them all in the time available, whether that is a debate format, a social media thread, or a conversation with a friend. The sheer volume of claims creates an illusion of evidence and substance, even though many of these claims might be trivial, tangential, or completely false. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite elegant in its manipulation. When confronted with numerous statements in quick succession, our minds struggle to process and evaluate each one individually. We experience what researchers call cognitive overload, a state where we simply cannot keep up with the incoming information. Our instinct then becomes one of two things. Either we retreat from the conversation entirely, which the Gish Galloper interprets as victory, or we attempt to address the arguments and find ourselves perpetually behind, always responding to the last thing said rather than making our own case. The person deploying this tactic has effectively shifted the burden of proof onto you while simultaneously creating the appearance that they have presented overwhelming evidence for their position. What makes the Gish Gallop particularly insidious is that it thrives in modern communication environments where brevity is valued and attention spans are fractured. Imagine you find yourself in a conversation where someone accuses you of harboring prejudice or holding problematic views, and when you deny the accusation, they respond by saying that your very denial is itself proof of your guilt, that only someone truly prejudiced would deny it so vehemently that your defensiveness reveals the truth you're trying to hide. This is Kafka trapping, a logical fallacy named after Franz Kafka's nightmarish narratives, where characters find themselves accused of crimes in systems where any attempt to prove innocence only deepens suspicion. The mechanism works by creating an unfalsifiable accusation, a claim so constructed that it cannot be disproven through any rational means, because the accused person's actions, words, or even silence become reinterpreted as evidence of the very thing they deny. If you argue against the accusation, you're seen as defensive or aggressive, which confirms guilt. If you remain silent, your silence is interpreted as admission or shame. If you ask for clarification, you're accused of playing dumb or gaslighting. Every possible response becomes twisted into confirmation of the original charge, trapping the accused in a logical maze with no exit. The psychological power of this fallacy lies in how it exploits our social instinct to seem reasonable, and our fear of being perceived as the kind of person who would commit whatever transgression is alleged. We live in an era where certain accusations carry such social weight that defending oneself against them feels nearly impossible without appearing worse, which means Kafka trapping has become normalized in our discourse despite being fundamentally irrational and deeply damaging to genuine dialogue. The tragedy is that this trap often silences people who might genuinely engage with criticism, turning legitimate conversations about bias into performances where honesty becomes a liability and the only safe response is capitulation or withdrawal. Imagine yourself in a conversation where someone asks you, "Have you stopped lying to your partner yet?" Or, "When are you going to finally get your life together?" These questions appear innocent on the surface, but they contain embedded assumptions that force you into a logical trap regardless of how you answer. This is the loaded question fallacy, and it operates by presupposing something controversial or damaging as established fact, then asking you to respond to a follow-up inquiry that assumes this presupposition is true. If you answer yes or no to either of those questions, you implicitly accept the hidden premise that you were lying or that your life is currently not together. The mechanism works because human communication relies heavily on cooperative assumptions. When someone asks a question, we tend to assume they're asking in good faith and that the premise is legitimate. Our brains naturally want to provide helpful answers, so we engage with the question as posed rather than stopping to interrogate its foundations. This cognitive shortcut served us well in honest conversations throughout human history, but it makes us vulnerable to manipulation when people intentionally craft questions with poisoned premises. The loaded question persists in our daily lives because it operates so smoothly beneath conscious awareness. Political debates are filled with loaded questions designed to make opponents look bad no matter which answer they choose. Workplace conversations sometimes deploy them as subtle aggressive tactics. Social media discourse thrives on loaded questions because they generate engagement and force people into defensive positions. We have normalized this fallacy to such a degree that we barely notice when someone has trapped us with one until well after the conversation has ended, and by then, the damage to our credibility or emotional state has already occurred. Consider the moment you find yourself standing in a health food store, reading the label of a skincare product that proudly declares itself 100% natural, and you feel an immediate sense of reassurance wash over you, a conviction that because something originates from nature rather than a laboratory, it must therefore be superior, safer, and more beneficial for your body and well-being. This appeal to nature represents one of the most pervasive logical fallacies operating in our daily decision-making, one that assumes anything occurring naturally possesses an inherent goodness or superiority simply by virtue of its natural origin, while simultaneously assuming that anything synthesized, processed, or human-made must be inferior or dangerous by default. The psychological mechanism driving this fallacy operates on several levels simultaneously, beginning with our deep evolutionary intuition that nature represents safety and familiarity, since our ancestors survived through intimate knowledge of plants, minerals, and natural systems for countless generations before synthetic chemistry existed at all. This intuition becomes weaponized by marketers and advocates who understand that humans carry an almost nostalgic yearning for authenticity and a subconscious distrust of modern industrial processes, making us vulnerable to suggestions that natural equals safe while artificial equals harmful. Yet the logical flaw becomes immediately apparent when we examine concrete examples. Hemlock and nightshade and arsenic all occur naturally, causing severe poisoning and death, while aspirin and insulin and countless antibiotics save millions of lives annually despite their synthetic origins, demonstrating that naturalness and safety exist on completely independent axes that have no causal relationship whatsoever. Consider the moment when someone insists that a particular practice must continue simply because it has always been done that way, whether that practice involves family dinner rituals, corporate hierarchies, religious ceremonies, or even the way we structure our work weeks and educational systems. A parent might defend a household rule by saying we have always done it this way, or a company might resist modernizing its procedures because they have functioned for decades, or a cultural institution might preserve an outdated tradition without questioning whether it still serves its original purpose or whether it actually benefits the people involved in maintaining it. The appeal to tradition fallacy operates by suggesting that longevity itself constitutes a form of validation, that the mere fact of something existing for a long time proves its worth, effectiveness, or correctness. This mechanism taps into our deep psychological need for stability and continuity, our comfort with the familiar and the established, and our tendency to view change with suspicion and apprehension. We inherit these traditions from our parents and ancestors, and there exists within us a powerful instinct to maintain what we have received, to honor those who came before us by preserving their ways. Yet this fallacy persists precisely because it conflates two entirely separate concepts: the historical continuity of something with its actual merit or logic. A tradition might have served genuine purposes when it was established, yet those conditions may have changed entirely, rendering the practice inefficient, harmful, or simply irrelevant to modern circumstances. We have normalized this reasoning so thoroughly that we rarely pause to examine it, often feeling that to question tradition is to disrespect heritage itself, when in reality, thoughtful evaluation of our practices represents wisdom rather than betrayal. Imagine walking into a technology store where a salesman enthusiastically presents you with the latest smartphone model, emphasizing that it contains brand new features and cutting-edge technology that no previous phone has ever offered, and therefore you should purchase it immediately without considering whether these new features actually solve any problems you currently face or whether they represent genuine improvements to your daily life. This is the appeal to novelty fallacy in action, a cognitive bias where something is deemed superior, better, or more trustworthy simply because it is new, recent, or modern, rather than being evaluated on its actual merits, functionality, or evidence of superiority. The mechanism operates through our deeply ingrained psychological association between newness and progress, a connection that was genuinely useful for much of human history when newer tools often did represent technological advancement and survival benefits, but which persists today even in contexts where age and tradition might actually offer more reliability and proven value. Marketing industries exploit this tendency relentlessly by constantly rebranding products with minimal changes, releasing updated versions with unnecessary features, and using language like revolutionary, breakthrough, and next generation to trigger our excitement about novelty regardless of practical benefit. We encounter this fallacy in healthcare when alternative medicine practitioners claim their newly discovered herbal treatments must be superior to established pharmaceutical interventions simply because they are lesser known and represent a departure from conventional approaches. Yet the scientific evidence supporting these claims remains absent. Similarly, in education, schools frequently adopt the newest pedagogical methods or learning technologies based primarily on their recency, rather than on rigorous research demonstrating improved student outcomes, SPENDI. Consider the moment you learn that a person has experienced tremendous suffering, perhaps a serious illness, a devastating accident, or profound loss, and notice how quickly your mind reaches for an explanation that somehow attributes this misfortune to their own actions or character. You might find yourself thinking that they must have done something to deserve it, that they made poor choices, that they weren't careful enough, or that their own personality flaws somehow invited this tragedy into their lives. This reflexive tendency to believe that the world operates according to a just system where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people is known as the just world hypothesis, and it is a deeply ingrained cognitive pattern that shapes how we interpret the suffering of others and ourselves. The psychological mechanism at work here is rooted in our fundamental need to feel safe and in control of our circumstances, because if we acknowledge that terrible things can happen to anyone regardless of their character or choices, then we are forced to confront the random, chaotic nature of existence and our own vulnerability to meaningless suffering. By attributing misfortune to personal failings or moral shortcomings, we create a comforting illusion that the world is fundamentally fair and predictable, and that if we simply behave correctly and make good decisions, we can protect ourselves from harm. This belief persists despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, despite our own experiences and observations of injustice, despite the countless examples throughout history of virtuous people facing undeserved hardship and unscrupulous people enjoying unearned prosperity. We maintain this fallacy because abandoning it would require us to live with profound existential anxiety, and so we continue to subtly blame victims for their circumstances, to believe that poverty reflects poor character, to assume that those who sue. Consider the moment when your coworker snaps at you during a meeting, and immediately you think to yourself that they are simply an irritable person, perhaps fundamentally rude or difficult to work with, when in reality they had just received terrible news moments before entering the room or have been dealing with chronic sleep deprivation that week. This tendency to attribute other people's behavior primarily to their internal character traits while simultaneously ignoring or underweighting the situational factors that surround them represents one of the most pervasive cognitive distortions we engage in daily, and it shapes how we judge, remember, and interact with everyone around us. The fundamental attribution error describes our automatic inclination to overestimate personality and character as explanations for why people do what they do, while underestimating the powerful role that circumstances, context, and external pressures play in shaping behavior. When you see someone being selfish at a grocery store, rushing ahead in line without acknowledging others, You might conclude they are simply an inconsiderate person, yet they may be rushing to the hospital, dealing with an emergency, or experiencing a mental health crisis that makes normal social awareness temporarily impossible. Meanwhile, when you yourself behave in a similar manner, you readily acknowledge the situational factors that explain your behavior, recognizing that you had a good reason, you were stressed, or you were not yourself that day. This asymmetry between how we judge ourselves and how we judge others persists despite our intellectual awareness that everyone faces invisible struggles, pressures, and circumstances that fundamentally alter their capacity to behave optimally. Imagine you see a person who is extraordinarily physically attractive walking into a room, and without knowing anything about their character, intelligence, or abilities, you automatically assume they must be kind, competent, and trustworthy simply because of their appearance. This tendency to allow one positive quality to influence your overall judgment of a person across completely unrelated dimensions is called the halo effect, and it operates silently in nearly every social interaction you experience throughout your day. A charismatic celebrity endorses a product they have never actually used, yet millions of people purchase it based solely on the assumption that because this person is famous and likable, they must have good taste in consumer goods. A professor with an engaging smile and excellent presentation skills receives higher evaluations on their teaching effectiveness, even when their actual course content and student learning outcomes are objectively mediocre compared to a less charming instructor whose material is superior. The mechanism driving this cognitive distortion rests on a fundamental shortcut your brain takes when processing information about other people, preferring to generalize from visible or immediately apparent traits rather than investing the mental energy required to evaluate each characteristic independently and thoroughly. Your mind essentially creates a glow around individuals who possess one admirable quality, allowing that luminescence to spill across your perception of their other attributes, whether those attributes actually correlate with the initial positive impression or not. We persist in allowing this fallacy to govern our decisions despite overwhelming evidence that one's strength tells us almost nothing about unrelated competencies. Yet we continue to trust attractive people more, assume successful business leaders are wise philosophers, and believe that accomplished athletes possess insights about nutritio. Imagine walking into a furniture store where a sofa is marked with a large price tag of $800, crossed out with a thick red line, and next to it displays a new price of $400 in bold letters. Your mind immediately locks onto that first number, the $800, as a reference point for value, and suddenly the $400 price feels like an exceptional bargain, even though you had no objective way of knowing whether $800 was ever a legitimate price for that sofa. This is anchoring bias, and it operates in nearly every transaction you make throughout your day without you consciously recognizing it. The psychological mechanism at work here is that humans unconsciously use the first piece of numerical information presented to them as a mental anchor, a starting reference point from which all subsequent judgments are made. When you encounter that initial number, your brain doesn't discard it as irrelevant even after you learn it might be misleading or arbitrary. Instead, it uses that anchor to create a boundary around what seems reasonable and acceptable. Salary negotiations work the same way, where the first number offered becomes the psychological floor or ceiling around which all counteroffers revolve, meaning the person who suggests the initial figure gains tremendous advantage. In dating apps, the first person you see influences your perception of all subsequent profiles. In news media, the first statistic mentioned in a story about crime, inflation, or unemployment becomes the mental reference point that shapes your overall perception of the issue for weeks to come. What makes anchoring bias particularly insidious is that it persists even when people are explicitly told that the anchor is random, irrelevant, or deliberately manipulative. Consider the moment when you turn on the news and see a story about a plane crash, and suddenly you feel anxious about your upcoming flight, even though statistically you are far more likely to be injured driving to the airport than experiencing any problem in the air itself. This is the availability heuristic at work, a mental shortcut where your brain judges the probability or frequency of an event based on how easily examples of that event come to mind rather than on actual statistical likelihood. When something is recent, emotionally vivid, or widely publicized, it feels more common and more dangerous than it actually is, and your mind relies on this feeling as a substitute for genuine mathematical reasoning about risk. The mechanism operates because your brain is constantly searching for mental efficiency, and retrieving memorable examples from your recent memory is far faster than consulting actual data or doing complex calculations about true probabilities. Your mind essentially asks itself not what does the data say, but rather how easily can I think of examples of this happening, and whatever answer emerges feels like truth. This heuristic persists so powerfully because we have evolved to be sensitive to threats, and a vivid example feels like evidence that something is genuinely dangerous, even when that example is merely an outlier or a product of media coverage bias rather than actual frequency. We have normalized relying on what we remember rather than what we know because remembering is fast, and often our brain feels confident in its judgments. Yet this confidence itself becomes a trap that keeps us trapped in systematic distortions about how the world actually works. When you scroll through social media and see repeated posts about a disease outbreak, you begin to believe it is sweeping through your community with alarming frequency, when in reality, the algorithmic amplification of certain content has simply made those. Consider the moment when you commit to a project with absolute certainty about how long it will take, whether that project is writing a report, renovating a kitchen, or learning a new skill, and then weeks or months later you find yourself still working on it while your original timeline has long since passed into irrelevance. This is the planning fallacy, a cognitive bias where we systematically underestimate the time, costs, and risks involved in future actions while simultaneously overestimating our ability to complete them on schedule. The mechanism underlying this bias is remarkably consistent across human psychology. When we imagine ourselves performing a task in the future, our minds tend to focus on the task itself in an idealized form, abstracting away from the messy reality of obstacles, distractions, competing priorities, and the simple friction of existence. We mentally simulate a best-case scenario where everything goes smoothly, where we maintain perfect focus, where no unexpected complications arise, and where we have all the resources we need precisely when we need them. Our brains are essentially optimizing for a fictional version of events rather than accounting for the statistical reality that most endeavors encounter delays. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent is that it survives repeated exposure to our own failure to meet deadlines. We experience the planning fallacy again and again, yet we rarely integrate this knowledge into our future estimates. Each new project feels like a fresh start where our optimism seems justified, perhaps because we genuinely believe this time will be different, or because we've learned some new skill or developed some new system that will finally allow us to overcome our habitual underestimation. Imagine you are considering a new job opportunity that offers a higher salary, better health insurance, and more flexible working hours than your current position. Yet you find yourself hesitant to make the change because this new job lacks the unlimited vacation policy you believe would be ideal, or because the office is not located in your dream city, or because the role does not offer remote work on every single day of the week. In this moment, you are engaging in what logicians call the Nirvana Fallacy, a cognitive error in which you reject a viable option because it fails to meet an imaginary standard of perfection rather than comparing it fairly against your actual alternatives. The mechanism operates quite simply in the human mind. We construct an idealized version of what we want, a utopian scenario that may not exist in reality or may be prohibitively difficult to achieve. And then we use this imagined perfection as the measuring stick against which we evaluate all real-world options. Because no actual choice can ever match the flawlessness of our fantasy, we end up paralyzed by dissatisfaction, constantly finding reasons why nothing quite measures up, why the imperfect present is somehow preferable to the imperfect but measurably better alternative. This fallacy becomes particularly insidious because it masquerades as high standards and discernment when in fact it is a form of magical thinking that prevents progress and improvement. We have normalized this pattern so thoroughly in modern life that we rarely recognize it for what it is, instead calling it being selective or having principles, when really we are simply comparing reality against a phantom that exists only in our minds. The Nirvana fallacy thrives in consumer culture, in relationship decisions, in political discourse, and in career planning, wherever humans must make choices between imperfect options and mistake the pursuit of perfection for the pursuit of something better. Imagine you are discussing a proposal to improve public transportation in your city, and someone says that the plan cannot possibly work because it won't solve every single transportation problem for every single person in every situation imaginable, and therefore the entire initiative should be abandoned rather than implemented as a meaningful improvement. This is the perfect solution fallacy at work, and it operates by rejecting any option, policy, or course of action simply because it fails to achieve absolute perfection or address every conceivable concern in a comprehensive and total manner. The fallacy rests on an implicit assumption that if a solution does not solve 100% of the problem with zero downsides and zero remaining issues, then it is not worth pursuing at all, creating a false binary between perfection and total worthlessness with no middle ground for pragmatic progress. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy involves our deep discomfort with ambiguity and incompleteness, for humans seem to crave certainty and totality, and when confronted with a solution that is merely good or substantially better rather than completely flawless, we experience a subtle cognitive dissatisfaction that can lead us to reject the entire proposition. We see this fallacy deployed constantly in political discourse when opponents of a proposal argue that since no policy can help everyone or solve problems entirely, the policy should not be implemented at all, ignoring the reality that incremental progress and partial solutions are how the real world actually functions. The fallacy persists despite its obvious logical bankruptcy because rejecting something feels like maintaining standards and refusing to settle, when in reality it often means maintaining the status quo while simultaneously condemning it for its imperfections. Imagine two people engaged in a heated debate about whether the earth is round or flat, and a third person steps in to suggest that perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, that maybe the earth is partially round and partially flat, or that we should respect both viewpoints equally because wisdom often resides in compromise. This is the middle ground fallacy in its most obvious form, yet it persists in countless situations where the stakes feel less absurd and the emotional investment runs deeper. The fallacy operates on a seductive premise, that the truth, by its very nature, must exist equidistant from extreme positions, that any argument between two opposing sides contains valid points worthy of equal consideration, and that taking a moderate stance somehow demonstrates intellectual superiority and fairness. In reality, this reasoning collapses under scrutiny because truth is not a sliding scale determined by how many people advocate for each position, nor is it located necessarily at the midpoint between two claims. Consider a debate about whether a particular medical treatment is effective. One side presents peer-reviewed research and clinical evidence, while the other side presents anecdotal stories and conjecture. The middle ground fallacy would suggest that the answer lies somewhere between proven efficacy and unproven claims, when in fact the evidence either supports the treatment or it does not. This fallacy thrives in our modern discourse because compromise has become conflated with wisdom, fairness has been equated with neutrality, and we have developed a cultural aversion to being perceived as extreme or dogmatic. We see it in political discussions, where complex policy questions are resolved by simply choosing the position that offends neither side equally, in scientific discussions, where evidence-based consensus is weakened by giving equal airtime to fringe theories, and in personal relationships where people avoid taking. Consider the morning when you wake up feeling inexplicably anxious, and you immediately attribute this emotional state to the fact that you didn't sleep well the previous night, when in reality your anxiety might stem from an upcoming work presentation you had temporarily forgotten about, or perhaps a conversation with a friend that left you feeling uncertain, or even just the natural fluctuations of your neurochemistry that have nothing to do with sleep quality at all. This is the false cause fallacy in its most fundamental form, the human tendency to connect two events or observations simply because one preceded the other, creating a narrative of causation where only correlation or mere coincidence actually exists. Our minds are extraordinary pattern recognition machines, evolutionarily designed to detect threats and connections quickly, and this ancient survival mechanism now betrays us in the modern world where complexity reigns and simple cause and effect relationships are far rarer than our brains assume them to be. We observe that stock markets decline after a particular political event and immediately declare the event responsible for the decline, never considering the dozens of other economic factors, global conditions, and investor sentiments that might be the true culprits. We notice that our productivity increased after we started drinking a certain brand of coffee, and become convinced that this specific product changed our life, when perhaps what changed was merely our belief that something would change, or perhaps the simple act of establishing a new routine provided structure our day was lacking. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy is our desperate need for order and understanding in a chaotic universe. The comfort that comes from believing we have identified a cause we can potentially control or influence. Imagine a colleague presents you with a scientific study about quantum entanglement, explaining how particles can be connected across vast distances in ways that defy everyday intuition, and your immediate response is to dismiss it as impossible simply because you cannot personally understand how such a thing could work, not because you have examined the evidence or consulted with experts in the field, but purely because the concept seems too strange for your mind to readily accept. This is the fallacy of personal incredulity, and it occurs whenever someone rejects a claim, an idea, or a piece of evidence by arguing that they personally find it difficult to believe or comprehend, treating their own lack of understanding or their inability to imagine something as proof that the thing itself cannot be true. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about the conflation of two entirely separate categories: what seems plausible to an individual mind based on limited personal experience, and what is actually true in the world independent of that person's comprehension. Our brains are built to rely heavily on pattern recognition and intuition developed through our immediate experiences. So when we encounter information that contradicts these intuitive frameworks, we feel a sense of resistance and discomfort that we often mistake for rational skepticism. We assume that if something were genuinely true, it would feel true to us. That reality should conform to the boundaries of what we can easily visualize or understand without significant effort or education. Yet this assumption reveals a profound misunderstanding of how knowledge actually accumulates across human civilization. For the universe contains countless phenomena that are genuinely true but require specialized study, mathematical training, or technological apparatus to fully comprehend. Imagine you mention to a friend that you've been feeling tired lately, and they immediately respond with an enthusiastic story about how their cousin completely changed their energy levels by drinking only water from a specific brand of bottle, and therefore you should try the exact same thing because it worked for someone they know. This is anecdotal evidence in its most common form, where a single personal story or isolated case becomes the basis for a universal recommendation or belief. The friend genuinely believes they are offering you valuable wisdom because they witnessed one person experience a positive outcome, yet they have completely overlooked the fact that this one example tells us nothing about how broadly effective this solution actually is, nor does it account for all the other factors in their cousin's life that might have contributed to the improvement. What makes anecdotal evidence so psychologically compelling is that stories are inherently memorable and emotionally resonant in ways that statistics simply are not. Our brains have evolved to learn from narratives and personal accounts because for most of human history, that was our primary method of acquiring knowledge, and we have not yet fully adapted to a world where large sample sizes and controlled studies provide far more reliable information. When someone shares a vivid personal story about how a particular diet cured their headaches or how a meditation practice transformed their anxiety, our minds create a powerful neural pathway connecting that narrative to the idea that it will work for us too, even though we lack any information about whether the person's situation resembles our own situation in any meaningful way. The persistence of anecdotal evidence as a reasoning tool despite its logical bankruptcy reveals something fascinating about human nature. We find abstract statistical data profoundly unsatisfying as a form of proof, perhaps because statistics feel imp. Imagine you wake up one morning feeling a slight scratchy sensation in your throat, and immediately your mind floods with catastrophic possibilities. You have read that a particular rare disease exists, and you have also read that this disease causes exactly the symptoms you are experiencing right now. Without even consulting a medical professional, you convince yourself that you probably have this disease, despite the fact that millions of people wake up with scratchy throats every single day for completely benign reasons like dry air or mild seasonal irritation. What you have done is commit the base rate fallacy, which is the profound mistake of ignoring the fundamental statistical likelihood of something occurring in the general population, and instead focusing exclusively on how well specific details seem to match a particular scenario. The base rate in this case would be the actual probability that any random person has this rare disease, which might be 1 in 50,000, but you have ignored that baseline entirely. Instead, you have become fixated on the conditional probability that someone with this disease would have these specific symptoms, which might be quite high. This is the essence of the error. You have inverted the direction of conditional reasoning. The psychological mechanism driving this fallacy emerges from our brain's tendency to prioritize vivid, memorable, and emotionally resonant information over abstract statistical facts. A story about someone who had a rare disease is far more memorable and emotionally compelling than the statement that 99.9% of people who experience this symptom have something completely ordinary. Our minds naturally gravitate toward narrative and pattern recognition, which once served us well in survival contexts, but now misleads us in a world saturated with information and statistical possibility. Imagine you are sitting in a courtroom and a prosecutor presents evidence that seems damning. A DNA match between a suspect and evidence found at a crime scene, presented with statistics showing that such a match occurs in only 1 in 10,000 people. The prosecutor then confidently declares that this means there is a 99.99% chance the defendant is guilty, and the jury nods in agreement, feeling the weight of mathematical certainty. Yet what has actually occurred is a fundamental confusion about probability itself, a mistake so common in legal proceedings and everyday reasoning that it has earned its own name in the annals of logical errors. The prosecutor's fallacy occurs when someone confuses the probability that evidence would appear if a person were innocent with the probability that the person is innocent given that the evidence exists. These are not the same thing at all, though our minds persistently treat them as though they were. The DNA match might indeed be rare, appearing in only 1 in 10,000 innocent people, but if 10,000 people could have been at the crime scene, then you would expect to find approximately 1 innocent person with that same DNA match by pure chance alone. The fallacy lies in jumping from knowing how rare the evidence is to assuming we therefore know how rare guilt is, without considering how many opportunities that rare event had to occur by coincidence. This confusion happens because our brains are drawn to the dramatic singularity of a striking match without properly weighting it against base rates and prior probabilities. We see the evidence and feel its power, feel the improbability of its occurrence, and mistake that feeling for evidence of guilt itself. The fallacy persists in courtrooms, in medical diagnosis scenarios, and in everyday suspicious reasoning because it satisfies our desire for certainty. Imagine you've been struggling with chronic back pain for months, and nothing seems to help, so you decide to try an expensive new treatment that promises relief through an innovative technique you've never heard of before. You undergo the procedure on a Monday, and by Friday your pain has noticeably decreased, so you become convinced that this new treatment is responsible for your improvement, and you immediately recommend it to all your friends. What you failed to consider, however, is that most chronic conditions naturally fluctuate over time, and your pain would likely have decreased anyway whether you received the treatment or not, a phenomenon known as regression to the mean. The regression fallacy occurs when we observe an extreme value in any measurement, and then mistakenly attribute a subsequent return to normal levels to some intervention or cause that we introduced between the two observations, when in reality the extreme value was simply an outlier and the system was naturally returning to its average state all along. This happens constantly in medicine, where patients attribute their recovery to the last treatment they tried rather than understanding that their bodies were simply healing according to their natural timeline, or in education, where a teacher might punish a student for poor performance and then credit the punishment when the student's grades improve the following week, not realizing that the unusually poor performance was a temporary anomaly that regression to normal levels was always going to occur. Our minds seem particularly vulnerable to this fallacy because we are pattern-seeking creatures who desperately want to believe that our actions have meaningful consequences. And when we observe a change following our intervention, we instantly construct a causal narrative that makes us feel more in control of our circumstances than we actually are. Imagine you are reading a description of a person named Linda who is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and deeply concerned with issues of justice and discrimination in society. When presented with two statements about Linda, you are asked which is more likely to be true, that Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. Most people intuitively choose the second option, believing it to be more probable, yet this intuition represents a fundamental violation of basic probability mathematics. This is the conjunction fallacy, a cognitive bias where people judge the probability of two events occurring together as more likely than the probability of either event occurring alone, which is logically impossible since adding additional conditions can only decrease or maintain probability, never increase it. The mechanism underlying this fallacy emerges from how our minds construct narratives and assess representativeness rather than engaging in strict probabilistic reasoning. When we hear the detailed description of Linda emphasizing her concern for justice, our minds naturally construct a coherent story in which she is a feminist bank teller because this combination feels more representative of the person being described, more internally consistent with her apparent values and personality. The description primes us toward thinking about feminism, and so the conjunction of bank teller and feminist activates more readily than bank teller alone, despite violating the fundamental rule that a subset cannot be larger than its containing set. We persist in this fallacy because our brains evolved to detect patterns and construct meaningful narratives rather than to compute exact probabilities. And this narrative-driven reasoning serves us well in many contexts, even as it misleads us in others. Imagine a financial advisor who spends countless hours studying historical stock market patterns, running complex mathematical models, and building elaborate spreadsheets to predict future market movements with impressive precision, only to watch their predictions fail repeatedly when real money is at stake. This person has fallen victim to the Ludic Fallacy, a cognitive bias that confuses the elegance and quantifiability of games and models with the messy, unpredictable complexity of actual reality. The fallacy gets its name from the Latin word for game, because it describes our tendency to treat complex real-world systems as though they operate according to the clear rules, bounded variables, and measurable outcomes of structured games like chess or poker, when in fact the world contains far more hidden variables, black swan events, and unquantifiable factors than any model can ever capture. The mechanism behind this fallacy is rooted in our deep human need for control and predictability, combined with our natural attraction to elegant systems that can be comprehended and manipulated through logic and mathematics. When we build a model or create a framework, we gain a sense of mastery and understanding that feels deeply satisfying, and this psychological reward makes us increasingly confident that our mental constructs actually reflect external reality rather than merely capturing certain simplified aspects of it. We become enamored with the internal consistency of our systems without recognizing that internal consistency is not the same as external validity. This fallacy persists because our brains are fundamentally pattern-matching machines that prefer neat categories and clear cause-and-effect relationships over the genuine randomness, ambiguity, and irreducible complexity that characterizes most important domains of life, from investing to relationships to public health to warfare, and we have normalized this pattern-matching tendency as RAT. Imagine a large corporation deciding whether to continue funding a major project, and the decision-makers examine only the metrics they can easily quantify. The number of units produced, the revenue generated, the efficiency gains measured in spreadsheets and quarterly reports, while consciously or unconsciously ignoring everything that cannot be reduced to numbers, such as employee morale, customer satisfaction nuances, environmental impact, or long-term brand reputation. This is the McNamara Fallacy in its essence, named after Robert McNamara, the defense secretary who relied heavily on quantitative body counts and statistical measurements during the Vietnam War while seemingly dismissing immeasurable factors like troop morale, strategic complexity, and political realities that ultimately determine the conflict's outcome. The fallacy operates on a seductive premise that only what can be measured matters, and therefore what cannot be measured does not matter, or at least matters so little that we can safely ignore it in our decision-making processes. The psychological mechanism at work here is both intellectually appealing and emotionally comforting because numbers provide clarity and remove ambiguity. They create an illusion of objectivity and control, and they allow us to avoid the discomfort of acknowledging factors that resist quantification or might complicate our preferred narrative. When we reduce complex situations to their measurable components, we gain what feels like certainty, yet we simultaneously discard crucial information about context, meaning, and consequence that exists beyond the reach of our measurement tools. The McNamara fallacy persists in modern institutions despite its demonstrated failures because our entire infrastructure of management, science, and governance has been built around the assumption that quantifiable data is trustworthy, while unmeasurable aspects are somehow less real or less important. Imagine you are reading a historical account of a pivotal moment in the past, perhaps the signing of an important treaty or a critical military decision, and the historian writes with absolute certainty about what the people involved must have known or understood at that exact moment in time. The author confidently asserts that the leaders surely recognized the long-term consequences of their actions, that they must have anticipated the social upheaval that would follow decades later, or that they deliberately chose a path knowing full well how history would judge their decision. This is the historian's fallacy in its essence, a subtle but pervasive error in reasoning that judges past events and decisions using knowledge that only became available after those events had already occurred. The fallacy occurs when we retroactively impose our current understanding, our modern awareness of how events actually unfolded, and our present-day perspectives onto people who were living in a moment of genuine uncertainty and incomplete information. Those historical figures could not possibly have possessed the omniscience that hindsight grants us, yet we frequently describe their choices as though they were made with full knowledge of future outcomes. This happens because human memory and understanding are fundamentally shaped by narrative patterns and the knowledge we carry into our present moment. When we learn about history, we learn it as a completed story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and this creates an irresistible psychological pull to see past decisions as having been made with awareness of their ultimate consequences. The people living through the events experienced only the present moment, clouded by uncertainty, competing information, and the countless possibilities that seemed equally plausible at the time. Imagine you walk into a crowded coffee shop wearing a shirt with a small stain on it, and immediately you feel as though every eye in the room has turned toward you, that everyone is noticing your imperfection and silently judging you for this minor flaw. You spend the rest of your time there acutely aware of that spot on your shirt, convinced that it is the focal point of everyone's attention, that strangers are forming opinions about your character based on this single visible blemish. Later that evening, you replay the moment in your mind, certain that you made a terrible impression, that people were talking about you after you left, that your appearance defined how they perceived your entire being. This experience is the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias in which we systematically overestimate the extent to which other people notice, care about, and remember details about our appearance, our behavior, and our perceived shortcomings. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy emerges from our own perspective as the center of our experiential universe. Since we are intimately aware of every detail about ourselves, every flaw we perceive, every awkward moment we experience, we assume that others possess this same level of awareness and attentiveness toward us. We project our own self-consciousness outward, believing that others are monitoring us with the same intensity that we monitor ourselves. Yet in reality, most people are preoccupied with their own insecurities and concerns, their own perceived flaws and social anxieties, leaving little cognitive bandwidth for sustained attention to others. We have normalized this irrational amplification of our social visibility so thoroughly that it shapes major life decisions, causing people to avoid social situations, decline opportunities, or experience genuine distress over moments that others have already forgotten or never noticed in the first place. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room while a supposed psychic or astrologer tells you that you are a person who values both independence and connection with others, that you sometimes feel anxious about the future, but possess hidden strengths you haven't fully explored, and that you have experienced disappointment in your past, yet maintain hope for what lies ahead. You nod along, feeling seen and understood, convinced this person has uncovered something deeply personal about your nature, something uniquely true about you alone. What you've actually experienced is the Barnum Effect, a cognitive bias where you accept vague, general statements about your personality as though they were specifically tailored insights meant only for you. The mechanism operates through our deep human need to believe that we are understood, that we are special, and that hidden truths about ourselves exist waiting to be discovered by someone with special knowledge or insight. The statements offered are intentionally broad enough that nearly everyone would recognize themselves in them, drawing from universal human experiences and feelings that transcend individual differences. Your mind performs the psychological work of personalizing these generic claims, filling in the specifics from your own life, your own memories, your own insecurities, essentially collaborating with the illusion of personalized insight. We encounter this effect everywhere in modern life, from horoscopes and personality tests to marketing algorithms that claim to understand our deepest desires, From cold reading techniques used in entertainment to the eerily accurate feeling we get when reading our zodiac signs' daily forecast. Despite our intellectual understanding that these statements are fundamentally nonspecific, we continue to fall under their spell, perhaps because the alternative feels lonely, the idea that no one can truly know us, and so we grant permission to the illusion of understanding. Frequency illusion, also known as the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, occurs when you suddenly become aware of something and then begin noticing it everywhere, creating the false impression that it has become more common or prevalent than it actually is. Imagine you purchase a particular model of car, perhaps a blue Honda Civic, and shortly after taking possession of it, you begin seeing blue Honda Civics on nearly every street corner, in every parking lot, and during your commute to work, leading you to believe that this vehicle has suddenly flooded the market, or that you have somehow developed a supernatural ability to attract identical automobiles to your vicinity. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in how your brain allocates attention and processes information from the overwhelming sensory environment that surrounds you at every moment. Your consciousness possesses a limited capacity for attention, and therefore your brain must continuously filter and prioritize which stimuli deserve your conscious awareness and which should remain in the background of your perceptual experience. When you become consciously aware of something, whether through personal interest, recent exposure, or deliberate focus, your brain's filtering system becomes recalibrated to flag similar stimuli as potentially relevant and important, pushing these observations into your conscious awareness more readily than before. This is not because the actual frequency of these stimuli has increased in any meaningful way, but rather because your brain has simply redirected its attention spotlight toward this particular category of information. The illusion persists because the subjective experience of noticing something repeatedly feels identical to the experience of something becoming more common, and your brain struggles to distinguish between these two very different explanations for what you are experiencing. Consider the moment when you notice that your friend has texted you 3 times within a week, and you begin to wonder if they are upset with you or if something has shifted in your relationship, when in reality, this pattern falls well within the normal frequency of communication you have maintained for years. Yet your mind has selected these 3 messages from the hundreds of interactions that occurred in that same time frame and assembled them into a meaningful cluster that suggests intentionality or significance where none exists. This is clustering illusion, the cognitive tendency to perceive patterns in random data or to assign meaning to the natural clustering that occurs in any sequence of events when you focus your attention selectively rather than examining the broader statistical context. The human brain evolved to detect patterns because patterns often indicate real threats or opportunities in our environment, yet this same mechanism becomes a liability in a world filled with randomness and noise, where any sufficiently large dataset will inevitably contain clusters of similar events purely by chance rather than by design. When you flip a coin 10 times and receive 4 heads in a row, you might feel that the coin is biased or that some force is at work. But the mathematics of probability tells us that such clusters are not only possible, but entirely expected within any sequence of random events. We observe this illusion when people develop superstitions around sports, noticing that they wore the same shirt during 3 consecutive winning games and concluding that the shirt caused the victories, when in fact they wore that shirt during dozens of games total and simply focused backward on the ones that aligned with winning. The persistence of this fallacy reflects something deeper about human consciousness. We are pattern-seeking creatures trapped in a universe that contains both genuine patterns and random noise in equal measure. Imagine a basketball player who has made 5 shots in a row, and suddenly every teammate wants to pass the ball to them because they appear to be in a zone, a state of unstoppable momentum where their next shot seems almost inevitable to succeed. The crowd roars with anticipation, the commentators speak breathlessly about the player's hot hand, and everyone watching genuinely believes that this person's probability of making the next shot has somehow increased beyond their normal shooting percentage simply because of their recent success. This is the hot hand fallacy, a cognitive error so deeply woven into how we understand performance and luck that it feels almost like common sense to believe in it. The mechanism behind this fallacy operates through our pattern recognition systems, which evolved to help us survive by detecting meaningful correlations in our environment. When we see a sequence of successful outcomes, Our brains automatically assume that something has changed fundamentally about the person or their circumstances, that they have entered some special state of heightened ability or fortune. However, the mathematical reality is far more mundane. Each shot in basketball is essentially an independent event with a probability based on the player's overall skill level, and a string of successful outcomes tells us nothing reliable about what will happen next. Our minds resist this independence fiercely because randomness feels wrong, because it seems too simple to accept that someone is not in a special zone after 5 successes in a row. This fallacy persists across gambling, investing, sports, and countless other domains where we convince ourselves that recent performance creates momentum, that hot streaks represent something real and predictive rather than the natural clustering that occurs within random distributions. Consider the moment when someone claims that because you cannot prove something is false, it must therefore be true, or conversely, because you cannot prove something is true, it must be false. This is the appeal to ignorance, a fallacy that takes the absence of evidence and transforms it into evidence of absence, treating our gaps in knowledge as though they were positive proof of a claim. In everyday life, this manifests when a person insists that aliens must exist because we have not definitively proven they do not, or that a particular conspiracy theory must be real because critics have failed to disprove every single aspect of it. The mechanism operates by shifting the burden of proof away from the person making the claim and onto the skeptic, creating an impossible standard where one must prove a negative, which is inherently difficult or impossible to accomplish. Our minds find this fallacy persuasive because we are naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty and gaps in our understanding, and the appeal to ignorance offers a false resolution to that discomfort by filling the void with certainty. We have normalized this reasoning in countless domains, from medicine to politics to personal relationships, where the absence of evidence becomes weaponized as a tool of persuasion. Someone might say they believe in a miracle cure because science has not yet explained why it works, not recognizing that lack of explanation does not constitute proof of efficacy. This fallacy thrives in the spaces between what we know and what we do not know, exploiting our tendency to fear the unknown and our desire to resolve ambiguity with definitive answers, even false ones. The antidote lies not in demanding absolute proof, but in recognizing that the burden of evidence rightfully belongs with whoever makes the affirmative claim, and that accepting uncertainty, saying "we do not yet know," is far more intellectually honest than filling silence with conviction. Consider a moment when someone asks you for a favor, not by explaining why their request is reasonable or fair, but by describing their suffering in vivid detail, hoping that your emotional response to their hardship will override your rational judgment about whether the favor is actually warranted or appropriate. A colleague might ask you to take on their project deadline by explaining how overwhelmed they are, how they haven't slept in days, how their personal life is falling apart, painting such a picture of despair that you feel compelled to help not because the request itself is justified, but because you cannot bear to witness their pain. The appeal to pity works by shifting the conversation away from the logical merits of an argument and redirecting your attention entirely toward the emotional suffering of the person making the argument, assuming that if you feel enough sympathy, you will abandon your critical thinking and simply agree to whatever they're asking. This mechanism exploits a fundamental aspect of human empathy, which is generally a positive trait, but becomes a vulnerability when weaponized in this way. The fallacy operates on the principle that emotional distress is sufficient justification for any request, regardless of whether granting that request is fair, feasible, or even in anyone's best interest. We encounter this daily in personal relationships, workplace negotiations, political discourse, and charitable appeals, where the focus is deliberately placed on suffering rather than on the actual merits of the case being made. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent is that sympathy itself carries moral weight in our society, and we've been conditioned to believe that withholding help from someone in pain makes us unkind or callous, even when that help is inappropriate or enables harmful behavior. Consider the moment when a salesperson tells you that you have excellent taste, that you clearly understand quality, that someone of your obvious intelligence would naturally recognize the superiority of their product, and suddenly, their pitch becomes far more persuasive than the identical presentation given by someone who simply stated facts without the compliments woven throughout. The appeal to flattery operates by praising the person you are rather than addressing the actual merits of what they're trying to convince you to believe or purchase. and it works with remarkable consistency across nearly every demographic and age group, regardless of how aware we believe ourselves to be of such manipulation. What happens psychologically is that the flattery triggers a sense of obligation and alignment within us, creating a feeling that rejecting the proposed idea would somehow contradict the positive image that has just been reflected back to us. And this cognitive dissonance becomes uncomfortable enough that we often find ourselves agreeing simply to maintain consistency with the flattering portrait someone has painted. The logical fallacy exists because the compliments have absolutely nothing to do with whether the claim being made is actually true or whether the product or idea has genuine merit. Yet we allow our emotional response to praise to override our critical evaluation of facts and evidence, effectively letting our ego become the arbiter of truth. We see this everywhere in our daily lives, from the advertisement that tells us we deserve the best before presenting an ordinary product, to the colleague who compliments our work ethic before asking us to take on an unreasonable project, to the family member who tells us how smart we are before asking us to agree with their questionable decision. Imagine you are having a conversation with someone about whether a particular scientific claim is true, and instead of discussing the evidence, they tell you that believing this claim would have terrible consequences for society, therefore it must be false. This is the appeal to consequences fallacy, a reasoning error where someone argues that a proposition is false because accepting it would lead to negative outcomes, or conversely, that a proposition must be true because rejecting it would produce harmful results. The logical flaw here is fundamental and profound. The truth or falsity of a statement has absolutely nothing to do with whether we would prefer the consequences of that statement being true or false. Reality does not reorganize itself based on what we find psychologically comfortable or socially convenient. A person might say that climate change cannot be real because admitting it would require expensive policy changes, but the actual state of the atmosphere remains indifferent to economic considerations. Similarly, someone might argue that a particular medical diagnosis must be incorrect because the treatment would be too painful, yet the diagnosis exists independent of our feelings about treatment options. The psychological mechanism driving this fallacy is rooted in our deep desire to maintain control and comfort in our lives. When we learn that something might be true and its consequences appear threatening, our minds instinctively reject the claim itself rather than sit with the uncomfortable reality. We have normalized this fallacy throughout our social discourse, from political debates where parties reject inconvenient truths about policy effectiveness to personal relationships where we dismiss unwelcome feedback because we fear how it might change our self-image. Consider the moment when a luxury automobile manufacturer releases a new model, and immediately, advertisements flood the market featuring wealthy individuals, pristine homes, and exclusive resorts, all designed to convince you that purchasing this vehicle will somehow elevate your status and grant you access to a lifestyle you've observed from a distance. The appeal to wealth operates on a fundamental principle, the assumption that because someone has accumulated significant financial resources, their opinions, choices, and recommendations carry greater truth value than those of ordinary people, regardless of whether their wealth was actually earned through expertise in the domain they're now commenting upon. A billionaire technology entrepreneur might be featured endorsing a luxury watch, and the implicit message transmitted is not simply that this watch tells time accurately, but rather that owning this watch connects you to the decision-making patterns and lifestyle choices of someone who has achieved extraordinary financial success. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy taps into our deeply ingrained human tendency to associate wealth with competence, intelligence, and worthiness. Even though financial success can result from inheritance, luck, timing, market manipulation, or simply being born into advantageous circumstances that have nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of the product being promoted. We encounter this fallacy constantly in everyday life, from celebrity endorsements of skincare products to wealthy investors promoting investment schemes, to influential figures promoting dietary supplements and wellness programs, yet we rarely pause to question why the net worth of the person making the claim should logically affect the validity of their assertion. Consider the scenario where someone argues that a particular policy or product cannot possibly be effective or worthwhile simply because poor people cannot afford it, or because it was not designed with poverty in mind. And therefore the logic used is that anything accessible only to the wealthy must be inherently flawed, elitist, or morally suspect. This is the appeal to poverty fallacy, a rhetorical device that conflates economic accessibility with logical validity, suggesting that the truth value of a claim or the merit of an argument somehow depends upon whether disadvantaged populations can participate in or benefit from it. The fallacy operates by asserting that if something is expensive or exclusive, it cannot be genuinely good, true, or valuable, creating an inverse relationship between price and worth that does not actually exist in reality. What makes this fallacy particularly insidious is that it can masquerade as social consciousness or moral righteousness, wrapping itself in the language of justice and equity while simultaneously employing faulty reasoning. A medical treatment might be extraordinarily effective at curing a disease, yet someone deploying this fallacy might dismiss it entirely because not everyone can afford the treatment, conflating the problem of access with the problem of efficacy. The mechanism underlying this fallacy relies on our natural human empathy for those facing economic hardship, exploiting our desire to appear compassionate and egalitarian by making us feel that agreement with their position demonstrates our moral character. Over time, we have normalized this reasoning pattern in many social conversations because it allows speakers to position themselves as advocates for the disadvantaged while simultaneously avoiding the harder intellectual work of engaging with actual arguments on their merits. Consider the moment when you dismiss an argument simply because of where it came from rather than evaluating what it actually says, and you have encountered the genetic fallacy in its purest form. Imagine a person listening to financial advice from someone they believe is morally corrupt, and instead of examining whether the advice itself is sound, they reject it entirely because they distrust the source. A student might hear a brilliant scientific explanation from a teacher they dislike and immediately assume it must be wrong, not because the explanation lacks merit, but because the genetic origin of that information taints it in their mind. A political voter hears a policy proposal from the opposing party and refuses to consider its practical benefits or drawbacks, dismissing it wholesale because of the party affiliation of its origin. The genetic fallacy operates by substituting an examination of the actual content, evidence, or logical structure of an argument with a judgment about its source, ancestry, or historical background. We confuse where something comes from with whether that something is true or valid. The mechanism runs deep in human psychology because we are pattern-matching creatures who learned long ago that certain sources were trustworthy and others were not. Our ancestors who could quickly identify whether information came from a reliable hunter or a deceptive rival had better survival odds. This shortcut served us well in small tribes, but catastrophically fails in a complex world where good ideas come from unexpected places and bad ideas can be dressed up in respectable clothing. We have somehow normalized this fallacy throughout our institutions, creating echo chambers where we accept information without scrutiny if it comes from our preferred sources and reject it reflexively if it originates elsewhere. Special pleading occurs when someone argues that their particular case deserves an exception to a rule or principle that they themselves have just established or agreed upon, without providing any logically valid reason for why their exception should be granted. Imagine a parent who establishes a household rule that all children must finish their vegetables before leaving the dinner table, yet when their own plate is served, they announce that they simply do not enjoy broccoli and therefore will not eat theirs, expecting no consequences while enforcing the rule strictly against their children. The logical mechanism at work here involves what psychologists call cognitive compartmentalization, where we unconsciously maintain separate standards for ourselves and others, allowing us to believe that our circumstances are genuinely unique when they are functionally identical to those of anyone else. This fallacy thrives because it operates beneath the surface of conscious reasoning, masquerading as reasonable judgment rather than presenting itself as the arbitrary exception it truly is. Consider the employee who insists that all team members must meet strict deadlines, yet consistently submits their own work late while citing personal circumstances that are no more challenging than those faced by their colleagues. The person committing special pleading genuinely experiences their situation as different, not through deliberate dishonesty, but through a selective attention that emphasizes aspects of their case while minimizing the similar circumstances of others. We normalize this fallacy throughout society because it often feels psychologically safer to acknowledge our own needs as exceptional rather than to admit that we want privileges that we would never grant to those around us. When someone has been wronged, they often justify their own wrongdoing by pointing to the initial harm committed against them, creating a logical loop that seems emotionally satisfying but is fundamentally flawed in its reasoning. Imagine a workplace scenario where an employee was passed over for a promotion despite excellent performance, and the manager who made that decision had favored a less qualified colleague instead. Now, when the overlooked employee begins to deliberately withhold important information from that manager or sabotages a project, they justify this behavior by referencing the original injustice. The employee reasons that because they were treated unfairly first, their retaliatory actions are somehow justified or neutralized, as though the second wrong cancels out the first one like a mathematical equation. This same pattern appears in relationships when one partner discovers infidelity and responds by having their own affair, believing the scales are now balanced. In social situations, nations justify aggressive military actions by pointing to past aggressions committed by their adversaries. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy is rooted in our deep need for justice and equilibrium. When we experience harm, we develop what psychologists call a moral imbalance, a sense that the universe has become disordered and unfair. Our minds desperately want to restore that balance, and when the normal channels for justice seem unavailable, we convince ourselves that creating an equivalent wrong somehow restores fairness. Yet logically, two wrongs do not create a right, and adding harm to an already harmful situation only multiplies the damage and extends the cycle. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent is that we have normalized it throughout human societies, from playground conflicts, where children justify bullying by saying their target wronged them first, to international relations where historical grievance. Imagine someone expressing genuine distress about their struggle to afford nutritious food for their family, and another person immediately responds by pointing out that people in developing nations are starving, so their complaint seems trivial by comparison. This is the essence of relative privation, a fallacy that dismisses or minimizes someone's legitimate suffering by pointing to greater suffering elsewhere in the world. The mechanism works by establishing a hierarchy of pain, suggesting that because worse circumstances exist somewhere, your current difficulties are unworthy of attention, concern, or action. It's a deceptively intuitive argument because on the surface it appears rational. After all, there objectively is greater suffering in the world, yet the logic fundamentally breaks down when examined closely. The fallacy assumes that acknowledging one problem requires ignoring all others, that compassion and resources operate as a zero-sum game where helping someone with a moderate difficulty somehow prevents help from reaching those in dire circumstances. In reality, these are separate issues requiring separate solutions, and someone's valid concern doesn't diminish another's validity. We encounter this fallacy constantly in everyday life, whether in workplace disputes where an employee's burnout is dismissed because others work longer hours, or in mental health conversations where someone's depression is minimized because they have it better than most. The persistence of relative privation in our discourse reveals something troubling about how we've normalized the suppression of legitimate grievances, how we've internalized a narrative that suffering must be ranked and tiered before it deserves acknowledgement. This fallacy has become so embedded in casual conversation that many of us deploy it without recognizing we're doing so, using it as a subtle tool to shut down discussions that make us uncomfortable or challenge our perspective. When someone tells you that the human brain is just like a computer, or that society functions like a body with different organs, or that running a country is similar to running a business, they are inviting you into a false analogy, one of the most seductive logical fallacies because it feels intuitively correct on the surface. A false analogy occurs when someone compares two things that share some superficial similarities while ignoring the critical differences that make the comparison fundamentally unsound. The fallacy persuades us by leveraging our natural tendency to understand new or complex concepts through familiar frameworks, creating a bridge of seeming logic that crumbles under closer examination. Consider how often you hear someone argue that because a vaccine needs testing like a new car engine needs testing, therefore we should be skeptical of vaccines, or because a family saves money by cutting unnecessary expenses, therefore a government should eliminate social programs. The psychological mechanism at work here is remarkably elegant in its deception. Our brains are wired to seek patterns and create mental shortcuts, and analogies appear to be efficient tools for communication and understanding. When presented with an analogy, we unconsciously accept the comparison without fully interrogating whether the underlying systems actually share the relevant properties that make the analogy valid. We become so focused on the similarities that we develop a kind of tunnel vision that obscures the profound differences. What makes false analogy particularly persistent in our daily lives is that some analogies actually are valid and instructive, which trains us to accept analogies reflexively without the careful scrutiny they deserve. We have normalized the use of analogies so thoroughly in education, politics, marketing, and casual conversation that questioning whether a particular analogy holds water often feels pedantic or argumentative. Consider the moment when someone argues that because a human body requires rest to function properly, therefore a company should never require its employees to work more than 30 hours per week, drawing a direct comparison between biological necessity and organizational structure, as though they operate under identical principles and constraints. This represents a weak analogy, a logical fallacy where two things are compared in a way that highlights superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences that make the comparison invalid or misleading. The mechanism works by leveraging our natural tendency to understand complex or unfamiliar concepts through the lens of things we already comprehend, a cognitive shortcut that allows us to process information quickly but leaves us vulnerable to false conclusions when the analogy breaks down in critical ways. We encounter weak analogies constantly in marketing, where companies compare their products to trusted institutions or natural phenomena without acknowledging how the situations differ in meaningful ways, or in politics, where opponents compare proposed policies to historical events that seem similar on the surface but operate in entirely different contexts with different variables at play. The persistence of weak analogies stems partly from their emotional resonance. An analogy that feels intuitively right or that connects to our lived experience carries persuasive weight even when logical scrutiny reveals the comparison to be flawed, and partly from the genuine difficulty in recognizing when we have moved from appropriate comparison into inappropriate oversimplification. We have normalized weak analogies to such an extent that they populate everyday discourse, from casual conversations about relationships to serious discussions about governance, where people confidently assert that because one situation resembles another in some respects, the same solutions or principles must apply. Consider the moment when a politician responds to a question about economic policy by suddenly pivoting to discuss their military service from decades past, as though honorable service in uniform somehow validates their current stance on tax reform or inflation management. The audience nods along, feeling emotionally moved, yet the two concepts share no logical connection whatsoever. This is the non sequitur in its purest form, a Latin phrase meaning "it does not follow," and it represents one of the most pervasive argumentative shortcuts we encounter in daily discourse. The mechanism operates by creating an emotional bridge where a logical one should exist, allowing the speaker to transition from one claim to another without establishing any actual causal relationship or evidentiary support. When someone says they should be trusted as a financial advisor because they once rescued a child from a burning building, the impressive feat of heroism has nothing to do with their knowledge of investment strategies. Yet our minds often fail to register this disconnect, especially when the emotional weight of the second statement overshadows our critical thinking. We encounter non sequiturs constantly in marketing, where corporations suggest that purchasing their product will somehow make us better parents, more attractive, or happier, despite the complete absence of any logical mechanism by which a particular brand of clothing or beverage could produce such transformation. The fallacy persists because our brains are naturally inclined toward narrative coherence, seeking to weave disparate elements into a meaningful story rather than recognizing them as unrelated propositions. We have become so accustomed to this pattern of reasoning that we rarely pause to ask whether the conclusion actually follows from the premises offered, instead allowing the flow of speech and the emotional resonance of language to carry us forward into acceptance of ideas that collapse. Imagine a conversation where your friend tells you they have been thinking about getting into shape, and when you ask them what that means, they say they want to feel better about themselves and have more energy throughout the day, which sounds reasonable enough until months later you discover they actually meant they wanted to gain weight to look more muscular, a completely different goal that was obscured by the vague language of getting into shape. Equivocation is the logical fallacy of using a word or phrase that has more than one meaning in such a way that the different meanings are confused or deliberately exploited to create an argument that appears valid, but rests on a fundamental shift in what a term actually signifies. The mechanism works because language is inherently flexible, and most words we use daily carry multiple definitions depending on context, allowing someone to use the same word in different ways within an argument, switching its meaning mid-discussion without acknowledging the shift. When a politician promises to fight for freedom while restricting certain civil liberties, they may be using freedom to mean one thing in their opening statement and something entirely different in their policy proposals. And because the word sounds consistent throughout, the audience often fails to notice the substitution has occurred. This fallacy persists so powerfully in human discourse because our brains are naturally primed to accept continuity and assume that when the same word appears repeatedly, it carries the same weight and meaning each time, a cognitive shortcut that served us well in simpler times but now leaves us vulnerable to sophisticated linguistic manipulation. We have normalized equivocation in corporate marketing, political rhetoric, and casual conversation to such an extent that we rarely pause to examine whether the terms being used are actually holding consistent meanings, and this normalization has created an environment. Consider a moment when your boss tells you that your performance needs to improve, without specifying which aspects of your work are actually problematic, or perhaps when a partner says they are unhappy with how things are going, but refuses to clarify exactly what behaviors or situations are causing them distress, leaving you in a state of confused uncertainty about what you should actually change or address. Ambiguity as a logical fallacy occurs when someone uses deliberately vague or unclear language to make an argument seem more persuasive than it actually is, relying on the listener's own interpretations and fears to fill in the blanks with meanings that may never have been intended but feel uncomfortably plausible. The mechanism behind this fallacy is fundamentally psychological in nature, because our brains are wired to seek patterns and create meaning even when information is incomplete or contradictory. And so when we encounter an ambiguous statement, we tend to project our own anxieties, experiences, and assumptions onto it rather than demanding actual clarity from the person making the claim. This means that ambiguity operates as a powerful tool precisely because it requires almost no logical support whatsoever. The listener does all the heavy lifting by imagining what could be meant, and then often acts as though those imaginings were explicitly stated rather than quietly fabricated by their own mind. We have normalized this throughout our entire culture, from political speeches filled with vague promises to marketing language that describes products using words so undefined that they could mean almost anything, to workplace communications designed to maintain flexibility while creating the impression of actually saying something meaningful. The reason ambiguity persists despite being fundamentally illogical is that it grants enormous power to whoever wields it, allowing them to appear authoritative and wise while simultaneously remaining I. Consider a scenario where someone observes that each individual player on a basketball team is exceptionally skilled at their position, and then concludes that the team itself will necessarily be the best team in the league, only to watch them lose game after game because the players have no chemistry, no unified strategy, and conflicting playing styles that undermine one another despite their individual excellence. This is the composition fallacy at work, a subtle but pervasive error in reasoning where we assume that what is true of the parts must automatically be true of the whole, or conversely, that properties of individual components will naturally combine to create those same properties in the larger system. The logical mechanism behind this fallacy operates on an intuitive but deeply flawed assumption that systems are merely the sum of their parts, when in reality, emergent properties arise from interactions, relationships, and organizational structures that exist only at the aggregate level and cannot be predicted or guaranteed by examining isolated elements. A soccer team filled with brilliant individual players might play terribly together. A restaurant with the finest ingredients and the most expensive equipment might serve mediocre food if the chef lacks vision and coordination. A democracy composed entirely of intelligent citizens might still make catastrophically poor collective decisions through miscommunication and polarization. We have normalized this fallacious thinking throughout our culture because it feels reasonable and requires minimal cognitive effort, allowing us to avoid the uncomfortable reality that complex systems behave in unpredictable ways that defy simple extrapolation from their components. And this persistence reflects our fundamental human desire to find patterns and certainty in a world that often operates according to principles of emergence and complexity that resist our natural inclination toward reduction. Imagine you read a headline stating that a particular national airline has a safety record of 99.9%, and from this statistic alone, you conclude that your upcoming flight on that airline will be entirely safe and without incident, as though the aggregate data about the entire fleet somehow guarantees the individual experience you will have on your specific departure. This is the division fallacy in its purest form, a logical error where we assume that what is true of a group or whole must necessarily be true of each individual part or member within that group. The fallacy operates by taking a characteristic, measurement, or truth that applies to a collective entity, and then distributing that truth downward to every single component without accounting for variation, distribution, or individual exceptions. When we learn that the average household income in a wealthy suburb is $150,000 annually, we might assume that every family living in that suburb enjoys that income level, failing to recognize that some families earn far more while others earn considerably less, and the average itself may not accurately represent the typical experience of most residents. The psychological mechanism driving this fallacy runs deep within how our minds process information and seek patterns, because generalizations and summaries are efficient mental shortcuts that reduce cognitive load, and our brains naturally prefer to apply broad conclusions to specific instances rather than maintain the nuance that reality demands. We normalize this error throughout daily discourse by hearing statements like all smartphones from this brand are reliable, therefore my phone will never malfunction, or this university has excellent graduates, so I will certainly succeed if I attend, each one collapsing the complexity of individual variation into a false certainty about singular cases. The ecological fallacy occurs when we take a pattern observed at the group level and assume it must apply to every individual within that group, creating a cascade of false conclusions about people we have never met and situations we have never examined. Consider the scenario where research shows that cities with higher average income levels have lower crime rates, and from this aggregate statistic, we conclude that wealthy individuals must therefore be less likely to commit crimes, when in reality the relationship between personal wealth and criminal behavior operates through entirely different mechanisms and contains countless exceptions that the group-level data simply cannot capture. The psychological mechanism driving this fallacy is our brain's natural tendency to treat aggregated information as though it were a universal law, because we are cognitive misers who prefer simple patterns to complex truths, and our minds evolved to find efficiency in generalization even when that efficiency comes at the cost of accuracy. We observe that countries with higher education levels tend to have better health outcomes, and we instinctively believe that every educated person must be healthier, ignoring confounding variables like access to healthcare infrastructure, sanitation systems, and nutrition that operate at scales different from individual characteristics. This fallacy persists in our daily reasoning because it requires no additional cognitive effort to maintain it. Once we hear a statistic about a group, the human mind automatically distributes that statistic across all members as though it were a fundamental law of nature rather than an aggregate observation that may obscure enormous internal variation and complexity. We have normalized the ecological fallacy because it makes the world feel more predictable and orderly, and acknowledging that group-level trends do not predict individual outcomes would require us to sit with tremendous uncertainty. The moralistic fallacy represents a curious inversion of logic in which we assume that because something is morally right or wrong, it must therefore be true or false in reality. Consider the person who believes that because honesty is morally good, dishonest people must inevitably face consequences and suffer, or that a virtuous person cannot possibly contract a serious illness because they have lived righteously. We observe this fallacy operating when someone insists that a particular scientific finding cannot be accurate because it contradicts their moral values, or when they argue that a beloved public figure must be innocent of wrongdoing because they have done charitable work. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental confusion between the normative realm, which concerns how things ought to be, and the descriptive realm, which concerns how things actually are. Our brains seem naturally inclined to collapse these two categories together, perhaps because living in a world where virtue is rewarded and vice is punished feels psychologically safer and more comprehensible than accepting that outcomes are often indifferent to moral worth. We want reality itself to be just, so we convince ourselves that it must be, and we interpret evidence through this lens of moral necessity rather than empirical observation. The fallacy persists so thoroughly in human reasoning because it serves our deep psychological need for meaning and order, even when such meaning and order do not actually exist. We continue deploying moralistic reasoning despite accumulating evidence that the universe operates according to physical laws entirely unconcerned with human morality, suggesting that emotional comfort often outweighs logical consistency in determining how we construct our understanding of reality. Imagine someone telling you that because something exists in nature, it must therefore be good, right, or the way things ought to be, and you find yourself nodding along despite a quiet voice in your mind suggesting this reasoning might not hold up under scrutiny. The naturalistic fallacy occurs when we assume that whatever is natural is automatically moral, beneficial, or preferable to alternatives, creating a powerful but invisible barrier to clear thinking. Consider how this manifests in everyday conversations. A person argues that eating only raw foods is healthier because it is natural, conveniently ignoring that many raw foods can be toxic, and that cooking represents a natural human innovation that has sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years. Another individual insists that competitive aggression in business is justified because it exists in nature, as if the presence of a behavior in the animal kingdom automatically grants it moral legitimacy in human society. The mechanism underlying this fallacy is deceptively simple yet deeply rooted in our psychology. We have evolved to respect and trust patterns we observe in the natural world, viewing nature as a kind of authority figure that knows best. This instinct served us well for millennia when our survival depended on learning from natural patterns, but in our modern context, it becomes a shortcut that bypasses actual reasoning about whether something is truly good or beneficial. The fallacy persists so readily because it wraps itself in the language of authenticity and wholeness, appealing to a romantic notion that nature is pure and wise, while human invention is suspect and corrupting. We have normalized this fallacy so thoroughly that questioning it can feel almost heretical, as if suggesting that not everything natural is good somehow amounts to a betrayal of environmental values or ancestral wisdom, when in reality, distinguishing between what is natural and what I. Consider the moment when someone observes that most successful people wake up early, and from this observation, they conclude that you ought to wake up early if you want to be successful, a subtle yet pervasive logical slip that occurs countless times throughout our daily reasoning. The is-ought problem, first formally articulated by philosopher David Hume, describes the fundamental difficulty in deriving prescriptive statements about how things ought to be from purely descriptive statements about how things actually are in the world. We observe factual realities about human behavior, social structures, and natural phenomena, yet we constantly attempt to extract moral obligations, personal rules, and universal principles from these observations without recognizing the logical gap that separates them. When you notice that your neighbor exercises regularly and appears healthier, you might conclude that you ought to exercise regularly, yet the existence of health benefits does not logically necessitate a moral imperative for your specific actions. The mechanism works through a kind of assumption that we rarely examine consciously, wherein we take what is naturally occurring or statistically common and transform it into what we believe should be universally adopted or personally required. This fallacy persists because it feels intuitive and efficient. Our minds naturally want to extract lessons and rules from observations, as this has historically served our survival and social coordination well. We have normalized this slippage between fact and obligation so thoroughly that most people navigate through entire conversations about how life should be lived, built entirely on unstated assumptions that translate observations into imperatives. The problem becomes particularly dangerous when applied to social norms, where we observe that society functions in a certain way, and then argue that individuals ought to conform to existing patterns, never questi. Imagine someone makes an extraordinary claim to you, perhaps that a particular dietary supplement can cure a serious illness, or that a certain politician secretly orchestrated a major historical event, and when you ask for evidence to support this claim, they respond by asking you to prove that they are wrong instead. This reversal of responsibility is the burden of proof fallacy, and it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how rational discourse and logical reasoning should function in our daily interactions. The burden of proof fallacy occurs when someone asserts a claim and then insists that the burden falls upon others to disprove it rather than upon themselves to provide evidence that supports what they have claimed. In logic and in rational argumentation, the person making the positive assertion typically bears the responsibility for providing credible evidence, research, or reasoning that demonstrates their claim has merit before others should be expected to accept it as true. However, what makes this fallacy so insidious in modern life is that we encounter it constantly across social media, casual conversations, workplace debates, and even family discussions where someone confidently states something dubious, and then places the entire weight of verification upon their audience. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a subtle shift in expectation where the person making the claim transforms the conversation from one about proving something true into one about proving something false, which are fundamentally different intellectual tasks requiring entirely different types of evidence. When someone asks you to prove a negative, they are asking you to accomplish something that is logically challenging because disproving something often requires access to complete information, while proving something true often only requires a single credible piece of evidence. Imagine you're in a meeting where someone presents an argument so lengthy, so densely packed with words, references, and tangential details, that by the time they finish speaking, you've lost track of whether their core claim was actually supported by evidence or merely buried under an avalanche of language. This is proof by verbosity, a fallacy where the sheer volume and complexity of words creates an illusion of substantiation where none truly exists. The mechanism operates on a fundamental principle of human cognition. Our minds have limited processing capacity, and when forced to wade through excessive information, we often reach a point of cognitive fatigue where we simply accept the conclusion rather than continue the exhausting work of critical evaluation. A person employing this tactic might string together numerous tangential points, cite obscure sources, use sophisticated terminology, and construct elaborate sentence structures, all while the actual logical support for their central claim remains absent or deeply flawed. The technique exploits our natural respect for apparent expertise and our assumption that knowledgeable people wouldn't waste time with unnecessary words. We've normalized this behavior extensively in academic writing, corporate communications, and political discourse, where verbose presentations are often mistaken for thorough analysis. The irony is that truly rigorous thinking typically produces clarity and conciseness, not obscurity and length, yet we've collectively internalized the belief that longer arguments deserve more credibility. What persists despite having no logical foundation is this association between verbosity and truth, an association so deeply embedded in our institutions and communication habits that challenging it feels almost like questioning expertise itself, when in reality, the simplest, most direct articulation of well-supported reasoning remains the most logically sound approach to pursue. Consider the moment when you raise a genuine concern about a complex social issue, perhaps questioning the wisdom of a widely accepted policy, and someone responds with a phrase like, "It is what it is," or "Everything happens for a reason," or "You can't fight City Hall." In that instant, the conversation stops moving forward, the inquiry halts mid-motion, and a comfortable fog of resignation settles over the discussion like a blanket designed to smother further thinking. This is the thought-terminating cliché at work, a linguistic tool that appears to offer closure and wisdom when in reality it functions as a barrier to genuine understanding. The phrase itself carries the weight of familiarity, wrapped in the comfort of cultural repetition, making it feel both true and final even though it explains nothing and resolves nothing. What makes this fallacy particularly insidious is that it operates through our desire for psychological comfort rather than through logical argumentation, offering us a neat little package of acceptance that requires no further mental exertion. The human mind, when confronted with complexity and uncertainty, naturally gravitates toward these crystallized expressions because they provide the illusion of understanding without the burden of actual analysis. We hear these clichés repeated in families across generations, embedded in popular culture, reinforced by peers who seem satisfied with their explanatory power, until we internalize them as genuine wisdom rather than recognizing them as conversation stoppers. The persistence of this fallacy reveals something profound about human nature. We often prefer the comfort of intellectual surrender to the genuine discomfort of sustained inquiry, and we mistake brevity for depth, familiarity for truth, and resignation for acceptance. Over time, we become so accustomed to these thought-terminating phrases that we forget they were ever meant to terminate anything at all. Consider the moment when someone tells you that you must believe something or comply with a demand, not because the reasoning is sound, but because they have the power to make your life difficult if you refuse, and this happens far more often than we consciously recognize in our daily interactions. The appeal to force, also known as argumentum ad baculum, occurs when a person abandons logical argumentation entirely and instead relies on the implicit or explicit threat of harm, punishment, coercion, or negative consequences to force agreement or obedience. A manager might tell you that the company's new policy is correct and you should stop questioning it, with the unspoken understanding that your job security depends on your compliance, not on the actual merit of the policy itself. A parent might insist that you believe something simply because they are larger and have authority over you, threatening punishment if you dare to voice disagreement. A government might implement a law and suggest that disagreement is futile because they possess the military and police force to enforce it regardless of public opinion. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite straightforward yet deeply effective. When we perceive a credible threat to our safety, security, livelihood, or well-being, our rational mind often takes a back seat to our survival instinct, and we comply not because we have been persuaded, but because we fear the consequences of noncompliance. This fallacy persists despite having absolutely no logical validity because it works, and it works precisely because humans are vulnerable creatures concerned with preservation. We have normalized appeals to force throughout our institutions so thoroughly that we often fail to recognize them as logical failures at all, instead viewing them as simply the way power operates in the world. Imagine yourself in a conversation with someone who presents you with an unconventional idea, perhaps something challenging to their worldview or something that contradicts their deeply held beliefs. And rather than engaging with the substance of what you have said, they simply dismiss it with a wave of their hand and a phrase like, "That's ridiculous," or "Nobody believes that," or perhaps they laugh in a way that suggests the idea is so absurd it does not even warrant serious consideration. This is the appeal to stone, a logical fallacy where someone refuses to engage with an argument on its merits, and instead responds with mockery, dismissal, or an appeal to the supposed obviousness of their position without providing any actual counterargument or evidence. The term itself originates from the philosopher David Hume, who famously described Samuel Johnson's response to Berkeley's idealism, where Johnson kicked a stone and declared, "I refute it thus," as though the physical act of touching the stone somehow disproved the philosophical argument without actually addressing its logical structure. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite subtle and operates on multiple levels simultaneously, including the human tendency to avoid genuine intellectual engagement when a position feels threatening or uncomfortable, the social desire to enforce conformity through ridicule rather than dialogue, and the deep cognitive bias that makes our own beliefs feel so self-evidently true that they seem to require no defense or justification whatsoever. When someone appeals to stone, they are essentially claiming that their position is so obviously correct that it requires no argument, and that anyone who disagrees is either intellectually deficient or acting in bad faith. Yet this refusal to engage meaningfully with counterarguments actually prevents the development of stronger reasoning and more nuanced understanding on both sides. Consider the scenario where a major corporation makes a controversial decision, and when journalists ask for comment, the company simply declines to respond or issues no official statement whatsoever. Yet the absence of denial somehow becomes interpreted as confirmation of wrongdoing in the public mind, or conversely, when a person remains silent about an accusation, their silence is treated as an admission of guilt rather than simply a choice not to engage with the claim being made against them. This is the argument from silence, a logical fallacy in which the absence of evidence for something is treated as evidence for something else entirely, or the lack of a statement on a particular matter is weaponized into proof of a hidden truth that was never actually established through any direct evidence at all. The mechanism works because humans have evolved to fill gaps with narratives, and when information is missing, our brains naturally generate explanations to restore a sense of completeness and understanding. We tell ourselves that if someone is not defending themselves, they must be guilty. If a company is not commenting, they must be hiding something scandalous. If historical records do not mention an event, it surely must never have occurred in the first place. The silence itself becomes the canvas upon which we paint our suspicions, our fears, and our preconceived biases about what the truth must be, never acknowledging that silence is simply the absence of sound and carries no inherent meaning. This fallacy persists in our daily discourse because it is psychologically easier to construct an explanation from nothing than to accept genuine uncertainty, and because silence itself can feel eerie and uncomfortable in ways that demand resolution, pushing us to interpret it as intentional concealment rather than neutral absence. Consider the moment when someone tells you that if a person is successful, then they must be intelligent, and because you observe that your neighbor is intelligent, you conclude that your neighbor must therefore be successful, which seems logical until you pause to examine the actual structure of the reasoning. This is affirming the consequent, a logical fallacy where we mistakenly reverse the direction of a conditional statement, assuming that if the consequence is true, then the original condition must also be true, when in reality, the logical chain only flows in one direction. The mechanism operates quietly in everyday thinking because conditional statements feel symmetrical to our minds, even though they are fundamentally asymmetrical. As when a doctor tells you that if you have pneumonia, you will have a fever, and then you experience a fever, leading you to believe you must have pneumonia, never considering that countless other conditions produce fevers as well. We encounter this fallacy constantly in marketing and persuasion, where advertisements suggest that if you use their product, you will be attractive and successful, and because you see attractive, successful people, you assume they must use that product, collapsing the logical direction entirely. The persistence of this error reveals something profound about how our brains process conditional information, tending to treat implications as if they were equivalences, creating shortcuts that feel intuitive but lead us astray repeatedly. We have normalized this reversed reasoning so thoroughly that entire industries depend on it, from fitness companies implying that their equipment creates fit people while ignoring all the fit people who never touched their machines, to educational institutions suggesting that their graduates become wealthy while overlooking the countless wealthy people who never attended. Consider a conversation you might have with a colleague at work when discussing why someone failed to achieve a particular promotion. Your colleague says, if you have excellent performance reviews, then you will get promoted, and then later observes that someone did not get promoted, so your colleague concludes that this person must not have had excellent performance reviews. This reasoning feels intuitive in the moment, as though the logical structure makes perfect sense, yet it represents a fundamental reversal of conditional logic that undermines the actual relationship between causes and effects in the world. Denying the antecedent occurs when we assume that if a condition does not hold, then the consequence cannot occur, which is a distortion of how conditional statements actually function. The original statement claims that excellent reviews are sufficient for promotion, but it never claims they are necessary, meaning other pathways to promotion might exist, or the person could have had excellent reviews while still facing promotion denial through some other mechanism entirely, such as budget constraints, organizational restructuring, or interpersonal politics. This fallacy operates insidiously in our daily reasoning because the structure of language itself encourages this kind of reverse thinking, and our brains naturally seek patterns and shortcuts that reduce cognitive load. We encounter this constantly in healthcare decisions where someone might think, if you have a fever, then you might have the flu, so since I don't have a fever, I couldn't possibly have the flu, failing to recognize that fevers can occur without flu and flu can occur without fever. In relationships, we often hear denials of the antecedent when people assume that if a partner truly loved them, they would remember every detail they've shared, and since the partner forgot something, the conclusion is drawn that they must not care, when in reality memory end. Consider a workplace where your manager makes an announcement that all employees who attend the morning meetings are committed to the company's vision, and then observes that you do not attend the morning meetings, concluding therefore that you are not committed to the company's vision. This logical structure seems persuasive in the moment, yet it contains a fundamental flaw in reasoning that goes largely unnoticed by most people who encounter it. The undistributed middle is a formal logical fallacy that occurs when the middle term of a syllogism fails to be distributed in at least one of the premises, which means the logical connection between the first and third terms is never actually established with certainty. In the example given, the middle term is employees who attend morning meetings. And while the first premise tells us something about all members of that group, the second premise tells us something about you, but it never establishes that your category and the committed employee's category have any necessary overlap or mutual exclusion. The mechanism works because our minds naturally seek patterns and connections, and when presented with two statements that share a common element, we instinctively assume a logical bridge exists between the outer terms, even when no valid bridge has actually been constructed. This happens because human reasoning relies heavily on analogical thinking and categorical associations, and when categories seem related, we assume their properties transfer across. What makes this fallacy particularly insidious in everyday life is that it often appears in contexts where one authority figure is making claims about groups, creating an impression of logical rigor that masks the underlying invalidity of the argument. Consider the moment when you learn that your friend has been dishonest about something important, and in your frustration, you declare that you no longer know who they really are, that this masked version of them has been deceiving you all along, when in fact you have known them quite well for years, and the revelation of one deception does not erase the thousands of honest moments you have shared. This is the masked man fallacy in its essence, a logical error that treats identity as a fixed, knowable thing that can be completely hidden or entirely revealed, rather than understanding that we are all complex beings containing contradictions and varying behaviors depending on context and circumstance. The fallacy operates by assuming that if someone fails to match our expectations in one significant way, then they must be fundamentally different from who we believed them to be, that there exists some true self underneath that we have been fooled about. Psychologically, this happens because we crave certainty and coherence in how we understand people, and when we encounter information that contradicts our existing mental model of someone, our minds prefer to discard the entire model rather than integrate the complexity. We tell ourselves that we never really knew this person, that they were wearing a mask the whole time, when what actually occurred is that we learned something new about someone whose character was always multifaceted and whom we simply understood incompletely. The fallacy draws its power from our desire for clear answers and pure categories, our resistance to accepting that nearly every person we know contains elements we approve of and elements we disapprove of, that goodness and deception are not mutually exclusive traits within a single human being. Consider the moment when someone says that society expects this of us, or the economy demands we work harder, as though society and the economy are tangible entities with desires and intentions of their own, rather than abstract systems created and maintained by human choices and behaviors. The reification fallacy occurs when we treat abstract concepts, ideas, or constructs as though they were concrete physical objects with independent agency and power over us. We take something intangible, a concept that exists only in the realm of thought and human agreement, and mentally transform it into something real and autonomous, something that can act upon us, influence us, or demand things from us. In doing this, we lose sight of the fact that these abstractions are ultimately just collections of human behaviors, agreements, and institutions that we ourselves have created and continue to sustain through our participation. When we reify concepts like the market, tradition, progress, or even love, we inadvertently surrender our agency to them, treating them as external forces rather than recognizing them as products of human activity that remain subject to human control and change. The mechanism works because abstraction itself is necessary for human communication and thought. We cannot function without generalizing and naming concepts. Yet somewhere between useful abstraction and genuine reality, our minds slip into a category error, and we forget the distinction between the map and the territory, between the word and the thing it represents. This fallacy persists because it conveniently absolves us of responsibility, offering a comfortable explanation for why things are the way they are and why change feels impossible, when in reality these abstract forces remain entirely dependent upon our continued agreement and participation to maintain their apparent power. Consider the moment when a psychologist or researcher observes a subject undergoing a particular emotional or cognitive experience, and then assumes that the subject's internal mental process must mirror exactly what the observer has concluded through their own analysis and interpretation, projecting their own reflective and analytical framework onto the lived experience of another person who may be processing that moment in an entirely different way. This fallacy occurs when someone mistakes their objective analysis of a mental state for the actual subjective experience of the person having that mental state, essentially collapsing the distance between the external observation and the internal reality. A therapist might observe a patient becoming quiet during a conversation about their childhood and immediately conclude that the patient is experiencing sadness or regret, when in fact the patient might be feeling confused, neutral, or simply thinking about an unrelated memory that happens to surface in that moment. The psychologist assumes their analytical interpretation of behavior corresponds directly to the conscious experience of the individual, but the human mind rarely operates with such transparent correspondence between external signs and internal states. The mechanism underlying this fallacy involves a fundamental confusion between third-person objective analysis and first-person subjective experience, where the observer forgets that understanding someone's behavior intellectually is not the same thing as understanding what they are actually experiencing from within. We have normalized this fallacy extensively throughout modern psychology, therapy, and even everyday social interactions, where people constantly interpret others' internal states based solely on behavior and then treat those interpretations as facts rather than educated guesses. The intentional fallacy occurs when we judge the truth or validity of a statement, argument, or work primarily based on what we believe the speaker or creator intended, rather than on what the statement actually says or what the evidence objectively demonstrates. Imagine a politician makes a statement about economic policy that is factually incorrect, but their supporters argue that the statement should be accepted as true because they believe the politician's intentions were good or because they trust that the politician meant well in saying it. The actual accuracy of the claim becomes secondary to the perceived goodness of the intent behind it. Similarly, consider a scientific study that reaches a flawed conclusion through poor methodology, yet defenders of that study insist the results are valid because they recognize that the researchers genuinely wanted to help people and had noble motivations for conducting their work. The mechanism at work here is a psychological substitution, where we replace rigorous evaluation with character assessment, allowing our perception of someone's motivations to override our critical analysis of their actual claims. This fallacy exploits our natural tendency to extend trust and good faith to people we like or whose goals we support, transforming that social courtesy into a logical error that distorts how we evaluate truth itself. We have normalized this fallacy extensively throughout modern discourse, particularly in polarized environments where supporters of various movements, ideologies, or figures will defend clearly false statements by referencing the supposedly positive intentions behind them. The logic seems almost compassionate on the surface because we are taught that intentions matter, and they do matter ethically and morally, yet the intentional fallacy confuses moral evaluation with factual evaluation, allowing false beliefs to propagate unchecked when wrapped in sincere-sounding motives. Imagine a person arguing that the word silly must mean something related to seriousness, because it originally came from the Old English word selig, meaning blessed or innocent, and therefore anyone who acts silly today must actually be demonstrating a form of innocence or divine favor, which somehow makes their behavior justified or wise. This is the etymological fallacy at work, a peculiar error in reasoning where someone assumes that the original historical meaning of a word must define its current meaning, or that understanding a word's ancient origins somehow reveals a deeper truth about what that word should mean today. The mechanism behind this fallacy operates through a misunderstanding of how language actually evolves over time, as meanings shift, transform, and diverge from their roots through centuries of cultural change and usage. When we trace a word backward through linguistic history, we are observing an archaeological artifact of how people once thought and spoke, not unearthing some eternal truth that should govern current usage. Yet people regularly commit this error when they argue that because the word person derives from the Latin persona, meaning mask worn by actors, modern persons are therefore fake or playing roles in life. The psychological appeal of the etymological fallacy is remarkably strong because it offers the seductive promise that by understanding origins, we unlock hidden meanings and secret truths that others have overlooked, giving us access to knowledge that feels both scholarly and revelatory. We have normalized this error in discourse because etymology genuinely is intellectually interesting and carries a certain cultural prestige, making it easy to conflate the fascination of word history with actual logical argumentation about what words mean or should mean right now. Consider the moment when someone defines a term in a way that conveniently supports their argument, sneaking the conclusion into the definition itself so that disagreement becomes linguistically impossible rather than logically addressed. A person might define freedom as the absence of all external constraints, which then makes any form of collective rule or social obligation automatically incompatible with freedom by definition alone, not by reasoned debate. Another might define love as unconditional acceptance, which means that setting boundaries or expressing disagreement with a partner's behavior becomes definitionally impossible if you truly love them, the conclusion already buried within the words themselves. The Definist Fallacy operates by collapsing the space between what a word means and what conclusion you want to reach, transforming what should be an open question into a settled matter of mere terminology. The mechanism at work here involves a subtle conflation of stipulative definitions with actual definitions, where someone proposes a narrower or more loaded definition of a term than is conventionally accepted, then uses this restrictive definition to dismiss opposing viewpoints without ever engaging with the substance of those views. When someone defines socialism exclusively as total government ownership of all property, any argument for public health care or education becomes definitionally socialist and therefore dismissible by those who reject the term, even though the actual debate about the scope and nature of government involvement remains unresolved. What makes this fallacy so persistent and nearly invisible is that definitions feel like factual statements rather than argumentative moves. And because language genuinely does require us to agree on what words mean, the definist can hide behind the appearance of linguistic clarity while actually performing rhetorical sleight of hand. Imagine a parent asking their teenager when they became an adult, and the teenager responds with silence because there is no single moment that can be pinpointed where childhood ended and adulthood began, yet we know intuitively that at some point this transition occurred. This is the essence of the Continuum Fallacy, a logical error that assumes if there is no clear boundary between two states or categories, then no meaningful distinction exists between them at all. Consider someone arguing that there is no meaningful difference between being slightly tipsy and being completely intoxicated, because you cannot point to the exact drink that transforms one state into the other, or someone claiming that racism could not possibly exist as a concept because they cannot identify the precise point where treating people equally becomes treating them unfairly. The mechanism underlying this fallacy operates through our deep discomfort with ambiguity and our desperate search for absolute certainty in a world that rarely provides it. Our minds crave clean lines, precise definitions, and clear boundaries, and when we encounter the gradual nature of reality, where things blend into each other through infinitesimal changes rather than sudden shifts, we struggle to make sense of it and sometimes reject the very categories altogether. We see this fallacy everywhere in modern discourse, from debates about climate change where skeptics argue that if scientists cannot identify the exact temperature at which climate becomes catastrophically disrupted, then climate change is not a real threat, to arguments about free speech where people claim that if they cannot define exactly where speech becomes harmful, then all restrictions on speech are meaningless. Despite the fact that we navigate continua successfully in every aspect of our lives, from adjusting the volume on a speaker to the spectrum of colors in a rainbow to the gradual acquisition of knowledge, we continue. Imagine a man who has owned a reliable car for 15 years without a single accident, and one afternoon he runs a red light because he was distracted by his phone, causing a minor collision with another vehicle. Later that evening, he explains to his insurance company that he is actually a safe driver because he has gone 15 years without an accident, and therefore this one incident should not count against him or affect his rates, since it was simply an aberration in an otherwise flawless record. This is the accident fallacy in action, a logical error in which we treat a specific event or situation as an exception to a general rule rather than recognizing it as evidence that challenges or contradicts that rule. The fallacy operates by creating a false distinction between what we claim to be consistently true about something and what actually happens in practice, allowing us to preserve our preferred narrative about reality without having to adjust our beliefs in light of contradictory evidence. Psychologically, this fallacy thrives because our brains naturally prefer consistency and coherence, so when confronted with an instance that breaks the pattern we have established, we instinctively classify it as unusual rather than representative, even when the frequency of such exceptions suggests they are not truly exceptional at all. We see this same pattern repeated across countless domains of human experience. The person who claims to eat healthily while regularly indulging in fast food, who dismisses these meals as occasional slips rather than evidence of their actual eating habits. The student who insists they are hardworking while consistently failing to turn in assignments, treating each missed deadline as a temporary lapse in an otherwise diligent character. The relationship in which one partner acts unkindly repeatedly, only to have those instances explained away as accidents of circumstance rather than accepted as representative of H. Imagine a situation where you observe that successful people tend to wake up early in the morning, and from this observation you conclude that waking up early is the primary cause of their success, when in reality their success may have come from discipline, opportunity, education, or countless other factors that simply happen to correlate with their morning routine. This is the Converse Accident Fallacy, a subtle but pervasive error in reasoning where we reverse a logical relationship and assume that because two things are connected in one direction, they must also be connected in the opposite direction. The fallacy takes its name from the logical principle that if statement A implies statement B, this does not mean that statement B implies statement A, yet our minds persistently violate this principle in daily life. We see a correlation and immediately flip it around, creating false causation in the reverse direction. Consider how this manifests when we notice that people who attend therapy often report feeling happier, so we might assume that happiness causes people to seek therapy when the actual relationship is quite often the reverse. Or perhaps we observe that wealthy individuals tend to invest in stocks, and we conclude that investing in stocks must cause wealth, overlooking the reality that existing capital is what allows someone to invest in the first place. The psychological mechanism driving this error is our natural tendency toward pattern recognition combined with our preference for simple, linear explanations of complex phenomena. Our brains are wired to spot relationships between events, and once we identify a connection, we often assume that connection works in both directions without consciously testing this assumption. We trust the surface-level pattern without examining whether reversing the logical arrow still makes sense or holds evidence. Consider the moment when a friend says to you, "I didn't say you were wrong," and the way they emphasize the word, "I" completely changes the meaning of the sentence, suggesting that someone else said you were wrong, or that they themselves might think you are wrong even though they didn't voice it. The fallacy of accent occurs when the conclusion of an argument is made to depend upon the particular stress, emphasis, or intonation placed upon words or phrases rather than upon the logical structure of the argument itself. And this manipulation of emphasis can fundamentally alter the meaning and truthfulness of what is being communicated. In everyday life, this happens constantly in conversations, advertisements, and political discourse, where a speaker deliberately or unconsciously shifts the emphasis from one word to another within an identical sentence to create an entirely different logical conclusion. And the listener accepts this new meaning without questioning whether the alteration of accent was justified or whether it represents a legitimate shift in the actual facts being discussed. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy is quite powerful, as human beings are naturally attuned to vocal cues, tone, and emphasis, and we instinctively process these nonverbal signals as indicators of truth and intent, sometimes even more readily than we process the literal words themselves. When someone emphasizes a particular word with vocal stress, our brains register this as a signal that this element is important or requires special attention, and we unconsciously accept the reframing that the accent implies without subjecting it to the same logical scrutiny we might apply to the explicit words. This fallacy persists in our daily lives despite being fundamentally illogical because we have normalized the idea that how something is said carries as much weight as what is said, and in many social contexts, this is actually true in terms of conv. Imagine walking into a political rally where a candidate presents themselves as a complete philosophical package, where supporting their position on economic policy automatically means you must also accept their stance on healthcare, immigration, and social issues, even though these topics are logically independent of one another and could reasonably be held in any combination by a rational person. This is the package deal fallacy, and it operates by bundling together a collection of distinct propositions or beliefs, and insisting that acceptance of one proposition requires acceptance of all the others, regardless of whether any logical connection actually exists between them. The mechanism works because our minds naturally seek coherence and patterns, and when someone presents ideas as an interconnected whole, we often accept them as such without examining whether that interconnection is genuine or merely asserted. We encounter this fallacy everywhere in modern discourse, particularly when brand loyalty encourages us to accept all products from a company simply because we enjoy one, or when joining an ideological movement seems to demand agreement with every single platform plank without room for nuance or selective adoption. The psychological component is powerful because humans experience cognitive dissonance when holding contradictory beliefs. So when we commit to one element of a package, there is genuine pressure to accept the others simply to maintain internal consistency and avoid the discomfort of ideological fragmentation. What makes this fallacy so persistent is that it has become normalized in our cultural conversation, where we routinely frame complex worldviews as monolithic entities rather than as collections of separable positions that deserve individual evaluation. And most of us have internalized the belief that intellectual integrity somehow demands complete consistency across all our opinions, when in fact wisdom often lies. Imagine you are sitting across from a colleague who has just given a presentation, and their face appears blank and unresponsive, which you immediately interpret as disinterest or disapproval, when in reality they are simply concentrating deeply or processing information internally, yet your mind has projected your own emotional landscape onto their neutral expression, creating a false understanding of their internal state that shapes how you respond to them for the rest of the day. The mind projection fallacy occurs when we assume that other people think, feel, believe, or perceive the world in exactly the same way that we do, projecting our own mental framework, values, and emotional responses onto others as though they were universal truths rather than individual variations. This happens because our own perspective is the only one we have direct access to, making it profoundly difficult for us to truly imagine that other minds might operate according to different principles, prioritize different concerns, or interpret identical situations through completely different lenses. When you are anxious about making a good impression, you assume everyone around you is equally focused on evaluating your performance, when in fact most people are preoccupied with their own concerns and barely noticed your minor stumble. When you find a particular joke hilarious, you assume anyone who doesn't laugh simply failed to understand it, rather than considering that their sense of humor might operate on entirely different wavelengths. The psychological mechanism underlying this fallacy involves what researchers call the curse of knowledge, combined with our natural egocentrism as conscious beings, which makes it remarkably difficult to simulate truly alien perspectives within our own minds.